Story 1. The Survey Line. This happened 3 years ago when I was 27. I was working as a utility line inspector for the power company, checking transmission towers across a remote section of eastern Colorado. The work was straightforward. Drive the service road, climb each tower, document any maintenance issues, and move on to the next one. This particular stretch ran for 42 miles through mostly empty rangeland, with the nearest town being Akron, about 30 miles south. I'd been assigned the job because I had experience with high voltage work and didn't mind the isolation. The pay was good, and I'd always preferred working alone anyway. My truck was loaded with climbing gear, cameras, measurement tools, and enough food and water for 3 days. The weather was perfect for late September. Clear skies, temperature in the 70s, and just enough breeze to keep the dust down. The first day went exactly as planned. I hit 12 towers, found a few minor issues with insulators and guy wire tension, but nothing that required immediate attention. I camped that night about halfway through the route, setting up my tent next to Tower 847. The area was completely silent except for the occasional coyote howl in the distance and the low hum of electricity overhead. The second day started normal enough. I was working on Tower 851 when I heard someone call my name from the base of the structure. David, clear as anything, in what sounded like my supervisor's voice. I looked down from about 60 feet up, but nobody was there. Just my truck parked nearby, and empty grassland stretching in all directions. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks. Sound does weird things in open country, and I'd been alone for over 24 hours. But then it happened again at the next tower. Same voice, same clarity, but this time calling, "Hey David, come down here." I spent a good 10 minutes scanning the area with binoculars, thinking maybe Jim had driven out to check on my progress. The service road was empty in both directions, and there wasn't anywhere for a vehicle to hide. I tried my radio, but Jim was back at the district office and said he'd been in meetings all morning. The third incident really got my attention. I was documenting some corrosion on Tower 855 when I heard my ex-wife's voice, clear as day, calling out, "David, I need to talk to you." That stopped me cold. Jennifer lived in Denver. We'd been divorced for 2 years, and she sure as hell wasn't wandering around in the middle of nowhere looking for me. But the voice was perfect. Her inflection, her tone, everything. I climbed down faster than I should have and walked in a wide circle around the tower. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see my own boot prints from earlier. But there were other tracks too. Bare footprints, human-sized but wrong somehow. The heel was too narrow, and the toes were spread wider than normal, like someone walking on the balls of their feet. They circled the tower base twice before heading off toward a low ridge about a quarter mile away. That night, I decided to push through and finish the job, rather than camp again. I had 6 towers left, and I could knock them out in a few hours if I worked by headlamp. But as I was packing up my gear, I heard Jennifer's voice again, closer this time. "David, why are you ignoring me? I drove all the way out here." I spun around with my flashlight, and for just a second, I saw something at the edge of the beam. It looked like a person crouched down, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall even while crouching, arms too long, and when it moved, it was on all fours but moving like it was more comfortable that way than walking upright. I got in my truck and drove to the next tower without looking back. My hands were shaking as I climbed, but I forced myself to focus on the work. Just 4 more towers, and I could get the hell out of there. But it followed me. At Tower 858, I heard my mother's voice calling from the darkness beyond my work lights. At 8:59, it was my brother's voice, asking if I needed help. Each time, the thing seemed to be getting the details more accurate. It knew I was divorced, knew my family members' names, even seemed to know I'd been working alone all week. The final encounter happened at Tower 861. I was 60 feet up, trying to finish the inspection by headlamp, when I heard my own voice calling from below. "Hey David, you need to see this." I looked down and saw myself standing at the base of the tower, looking up. Same build, same work clothes, even the same beat-up hard hat I was wearing. But the face was wrong. The features were close, but not quite right. Like a photo that was slightly out of focus, and the eyes reflected my headlamp beam like an animal's. I've never climbed down a transmission tower so fast in my life. I hit the ground, threw my gear in the truck, and drove straight back to town without stopping. Did the last tower the next week with a two-man crew. When I filed my report, I mentioned equipment problems and recommended the final section be inspected by a full team. My supervisor didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer any details. I still work for the power company, but I turned down the next solo assignment. Told them I preferred working with a partner for safety reasons. The thing is, about 6 months later, I ran into another lineman who'd worked that same stretch the previous year. He mentioned hearing voices while he was up on the towers, family members calling his name from empty rangeland. He'd finished the job, but he'd requested transfer to a different district right after. I kept that conversation to myself, but I never forgot it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd climbed down, when that thing wearing my face asked me to. I'm pretty sure I don't want to know. Story 2. The Wind Farm. This happened 2 years ago, when I was 24. I was working night security at a wind farm outside Sweetwater, Texas. One of those massive installations with over 100 turbines spread across 15,000 acres of ranch land. The job was pretty straightforward. Drive the perimeter roads, check the transformer stations, and make sure nobody was messing with the equipment. Most nights, I'd see maybe 2 or 3 vehicles on the distant highway, and that was it. I'd taken the job because it paid well and fit my schedule. I was finishing up my degree in criminal justice and needed something that would let me study between rounds. The wind farm was completely automated, so unless there was an equipment failure or a security breach, I basically just had to stay awake and be visible. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I had a company truck equipped with spotlights and a radio that connected me to the maintenance dispatch center in Lubbock. The installation was divided into 4 sectors, and I was supposed to drive each sector once per hour, spending about 10 minutes at each transformer station checking for any obvious problems. The first few weeks went by without incident. The biggest excitement was chasing off teenage kids who sometimes tried to party near the access roads. The landscape was typical West Texas, flat, scrubby, with scattered mesquite and not much else. During the day, you could see for miles in any direction. At night, the only lights were the red beacons on top of the turbines and the occasional headlights on Highway 70, about 3 miles to the north. The weird stuff started in October. I was making my usual rounds when I noticed that some of the turbines in Sector 3 had stopped turning. That wasn't unusual. They shut down automatically when the wind speed dropped too low or got too high. But these particular units were still, while others nearby were spinning normally. I radioed it in. and dispatch told me a technician would check them in the morning. But the next night, different turbines were stopped. Same sector, but a different cluster. And the night after that, it was a third group, always in Sector 3, always seemingly random, and always with no obvious mechanical reason. The maintenance guys couldn't find anything wrong during their day shifts. That's when I started paying more attention to Sector 3. It covered the northwest corner of the property, where the land sloped up toward a low mesa. There was an old stock tank up there, left over from when the area had been used for cattle grazing, and the access road wound through a series of small arroyos before climbing to the higher ground. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a coyote. Just a glimpse of something four-legged moving between the turbine foundations, caught in my headlights for a second, before disappearing into the shadows. That wasn't unusual. Coyotes were common in the area, and they didn't seem bothered by the noise of the turbines. But this one was bigger than any coyote I'd ever seen. Maybe the size of a large German shepherd, but leaner, with longer legs. And it moved differently, more fluid, like it was perfectly comfortable in the darkness. The second sighting happened 3 nights later. I was checking the transformer station at the base of the mesa when my spotlight caught something moving near the old stock tank. Same animal, but this time it was closer, maybe 50 yards away. When the light hit it, it stopped and looked directly at me. The eyes reflected green, like a cat's, but they were too high off the ground. Whatever this thing was, it was taller than any coyote had a right to be. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds before it turned and loped away, disappearing over a ridge. But as it moved, I could swear it was switching between running on 4 legs and something that looked more like a person running hunched over. The third incident convinced me something was seriously wrong. I was driving the perimeter road in Sector 3 when my radio started picking up interference. Static mixed with what sounded like voices speaking too low to understand. I tried switching channels, but the interference followed me. Then my truck's electrical system started acting up. The headlights dimmed, the dashboard lights flickered, and the engine began running rough. I pulled over to check under the hood, and that's when I heard it calling my name. Marcus, clear as anything, in my girlfriend's voice. Marcus, where are you? I looked around, but there was nothing but empty rangeland and the shadows of the turbines. Sarah was at her apartment in Lubbock, 40 miles away, probably asleep. There was no way she was out here. Marcus, I'm lost. Can you help me? The voice was coming from somewhere up near the mesa, but it was too dark to see anything beyond my headlights. I got back in the truck and tried to drive away, but the engine died completely. All the electrical systems went dead. No lights, no radio, nothing. I was sitting in complete darkness except for the red beacons on the turbines, and I could hear something moving around the truck. Footsteps, but not quite right. Too heavy for a human, but with a rhythm that suggested something walking upright. Whatever it was circled the truck twice before stopping right outside the driver's side door. I could hear it breathing, slow and deep, and then Sarah's voice again, but closer. Marcus, why won't you answer me? Open the door. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, before the electrical system suddenly came back to life. The headlights blazed on. The engine started, and my radio crackled with normal dispatch traffic. Whatever had been outside was gone. I drove straight to the security office and called my supervisor. Told him I was feeling sick and needed to go home. He wasn't happy, but he arranged for the day's security guy to come in early. The next morning, I went back to Sector 3 with the maintenance crew. We found tracks around where my truck had broken down. bare footprints that looked almost human except for the size and the way the toes were spread. They led from the road up toward the mesa, but disappeared in the rocky ground about halfway up. One of the technicians, an older guy named Pete, who'd worked in the area for 20 years, took a look at the tracks and shook his head. "You don't want to be out here alone at night," he told me. "This whole section of the county has a reputation. Ranchers used to avoid it after dark, back when it was grazing land." I asked him what he meant, but he just said they were old stories, things people didn't talk about much anymore. He suggested I request a partner for the night shift, or ask to be transferred to one of the other wind farms. I lasted 2 more weeks before I took his advice, put in for a transfer, and went back to day shift work. The company didn't ask too many questions. Apparently, they'd had trouble keeping night security at that particular installation. About 6 months later, I heard through the grapevine that they'd had to install a team of 2 guards for the night shift. Even then, they had trouble keeping people. The official reason was enhanced security protocols. But the word was that too many guards were requesting transfers after just a few weeks on the job. I never did find out what was up there on that mesa. But sometimes, when the wind is blowing hard and I'm driving past wind farms, I remember that night in Sector 3, and I'm glad I decided to work days. Story 3. The Research Station. This happened when I was 22, during my senior year studying wildlife biology at Colorado State. I'd landed an internship with the Forest Service, helping with a long-term study on elk migration patterns in the Routt National Forest. The project required someone to staff a remote research station for 2 weeks at a time, collecting data from motion-activated cameras and radio collars. The station was located about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by ATV or on foot. It consisted of a small cabin, a solar power system, and communication equipment that let me check in with the base station twice daily. The work itself was pretty routine. Download camera data, track tagged animals, record weather conditions, and maintain the equipment. I was partnered with another student, Jenny Martinez, who was working on her master's thesis. We'd alternate 2-week shifts, so there was always someone at the station during the peak migration season. Jenny had been up there for the first rotation and said it was peaceful but kind of eerie at night, with all the elk calls and other wildlife sounds. My first few days went smoothly. The weather was good for early November, and I was getting great data. The elk were moving through the area in decent numbers, and I was documenting their patterns with the GPS tracking system. The cabin was comfortable enough, and I actually enjoyed the solitude after spending months on campus. The first strange thing I noticed was that some of the trail cameras had been moved, not knocked over by animals, actually repositioned, turned to face different directions. Camera 15, which was supposed to monitor a game trail, had been rotated to point directly at the cabin. Camera 23 was now aimed at the solar panel array, instead of the water source it was meant to observe. I figured maybe Jenny had adjusted them for some reason, and forgotten to mention it in her notes. I moved them back to their original positions and made a note to ask her about it during my next radio check. But the next morning, 3 more cameras had been moved. This time, they were all pointing toward the cabin from different angles, like someone had set up a surveillance perimeter. The memory card showed nothing but empty forest and the occasional deer or elk, but the timestamps indicated the cameras had been moved during the night. I spent that day doing a complete inventory of the equipment. Everything was accounted for, but several items had been relocated. My spare batteries were stacked in a neat pile outside the cabin door. The weather monitoring equipment had been disconnected and carefully set aside. Even my personal gear had been gone through. My backpack was repacked, but nothing was missing. That night, I decided to stay awake and watch for whatever was messing with the equipment. I set up in the cabin with all the lights off, just the glow from the monitoring equipment to see by. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the wooden deck outside. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone trying not to make noise. I crept to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The footsteps continued around the cabin, stopping at each window as if whoever was out there was looking in. Then I heard Jenny's voice, soft and urgent. "Hey, are you awake? I need to talk to you about something." That didn't make sense. Jenny was back at the university, and there was no way she could have hiked up here in the dark. Plus, we had radio protocols. If there was an emergency, she would have called on the scheduled frequency. "Jenny?" I called out softly, but there was no response. The footsteps had stopped. I waited about 20 minutes before checking outside with a flashlight. I found bare footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Human-shaped but wrong somehow. They were too long and narrow, with the toes spread wider than normal. The stride length suggested someone much taller than Jenny's 5'4" frame. The next day, I tried reaching the base station on the radio, but I was only getting static. The equipment seemed to be working fine, but I couldn't raise anyone on any frequency. I had 3 more days before my scheduled pickup, so I decided to stick it out and report everything when the supply truck came. But that night, things escalated. I was awakened around midnight by the sound of someone moving around inside the cabin. I could hear footsteps on the wooden floor, drawers being opened and closed, papers being shuffled. But when I sat up and turned on my flashlight, the cabin was empty. I searched every corner, checked the door and windows. Everything was locked from the inside. But my research notes had been reorganized, and some of the data sheets were missing. Not destroyed or scattered, just gone. The next morning, I found the missing papers stuck to trees around the research site, about 50 feet apart, forming a rough circle with the cabin at the center. They were undamaged, just carefully attached to bark with what looked like pine sap. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I packed up the essential equipment, secured the cabin, and started hiking out. It was a 15-mile walk to the access road, but I'd rather spend the night in the woods than stay at that station another day. I made it about 3 miles before I realized I was being followed. I kept hearing footsteps behind me on the trail, matching my pace exactly. Every time I stopped to listen, the footsteps would stop too, but I never saw anything when I turned around. Around sunset, I heard Jenny's voice again, this time coming from deeper in the woods. "Where are you going? You're supposed to stay at the station." Then, a few minutes later, "Come back. I have something to show you." I kept walking, but the voice followed me. Sometimes Jenny's, sometimes other people I knew. My advisor from school, my roommate, even my mother. All of them telling me to come back, that I was making a mistake, that I was needed at the research station. As it got darker, I started seeing movement in the trees alongside the trail. Something keeping pace with me, but staying just out of sight. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure walking upright but too tall, with arms that hung too low. I finally made it to the access road around 10 p.m., where I had a cell signal and could call for pickup. The Forest Service truck reached me about an hour later, and I was never so happy to see headlights. When I filed my report, I focused on equipment malfunctions and communication problems. I mentioned finding the cameras moved and suggested that bears or elk might have been investigating the station. I didn't mention the voices or the footprints or the feeling of being watched. The Forest Service sent a team up to retrieve the equipment and secure the station for the winter. They found everything in good condition, with no signs of animal intrusion or human interference. The trail cameras showed normal wildlife activity, but there were several hours of footage from each camera that were just missing. The timestamps jumped from one day to the next with no explanation. Jenny finished her thesis using data from other research sites, and the elk migration study was moved to a different location the following year. I never asked why, and nobody volunteered an explanation. I still work in wildlife biology, but I stick to projects that involve teams of researchers. There's something to be said for having people around when you're spending time in remote areas. You never know what's out there watching you work. Story 4. The Oil Patch. This happened last year when I was 25. I was working as a roughneck for a drilling company operating in the Bakken formation, up in western North Dakota. It was hard work, but the money was good. Better than anything I could make back home in Michigan. Most of our sites were in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by gravel roads that turned into mud soup when it rained. The particular well I'm talking about was about 40 miles northeast of Williston, on what used to be wheat fields before the oil boom. We were running a night tower, 12-hour shifts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., which meant I spent a lot of time in that empty country after dark. Our crew consisted of 4 guys, myself, Tommy, the derrick hand, Pete, our motorman, and Ray, who was the tool pusher and had been working oil rigs for about 15 years. The work itself was routine. We were drilling a horizontal well, which meant long stretches of steady drilling with periodic stops to add pipe or adjust the drilling mud. During the quiet periods, you could hear everything. Coyotes wind through the prairie grass, and the distant sound of trucks on Highway 85. About 2 weeks into the job, we started noticing that some of our equipment was being messed with during the day shift. Nothing major. Tools moved around, settings on machinery adjusted, that sort of thing. The day crew swore they weren't responsible, and there was no reason for them to lie about it. Ray figured it was probably kids from one of the nearby farms, maybe trying to steal copper or diesel fuel. He arranged for the company to install some motion-activated security cameras around the rig site focused on the equipment storage areas and fuel tanks. The cameras didn't catch any thieves, but they did pick up some weird footage. Most of the motion triggers were caused by normal wildlife, deer, coyotes, the occasional skunk, but there were several clips that showed what looked like a large dog or coyote walking upright on its hind legs, moving through the shadows at the edge of the work lights. Tommy was the first one to point it out during our shift. He was reviewing the day's footage on his phone and called us over to take a look. "Check this out," he said, showing us a 30-second clip of something moving between the pumpjacks about 50 yards from the rig. It was hard to make out clearly, but whatever it was definitely moving on 2 legs. The proportions were wrong for a human. Too tall, too thin, with what looked like an elongated head or snout. It paused for a moment, seeming to look directly at the camera, before disappearing into the darkness. Pete laughed it off as probably just a bear standing up to get a better look around. North Dakota doesn't have many bears, but they're not unheard of. Ray was more skeptical. He'd worked all over the country, and he'd never seen a bear move like that. The next night, we started hearing sounds that didn't fit the normal background noise. Not animal sounds exactly, but not mechanical either. Kind of a low humming or chanting that seemed to come from different directions around the rig site. When one of us would go to investigate, the sound would stop. Then Tommy started claiming he heard voices calling his name from out in the prairie. He was up on the derrick, about 90 feet off the ground, when he came down and said someone had been yelling for him from the direction of the access road. The rest of us had been right there on the rig floor, and we hadn't heard anything. Ray sent me to check the road with a spotlight, but there were no vehicles, no people, nothing. Just empty grassland stretching toward the horizon. Over the next few days it got worse. All of us started hearing voices, family members, friends, people we knew calling our names from the darkness beyond the work lights. The weird part was that the voices were perfect. When I heard my ex-girlfriend Sarah calling for me, it was exactly her voice, her inflection, everything. The breaking point came during our shift about a week later. We were tripping pipe, pulling sections out of the hole for maintenance, which is detailed, dangerous work that requires complete attention. I was operating the draw works when I heard my father's voice, clear as day, calling me from somewhere near the mud tanks. "Bobby, I need to talk to you. It's important." My father had been dead for 3 years. Cancer took him when I was still in college, but that was his voice, no question about it. I nearly lost control of the draw works before Ray grabbed my shoulder and took over. "What the hell's wrong with you?" he shouted over the noise of the rig. I told him what I'd heard, and his face went white. Turned out he'd been hearing his deceased wife's voice for the past 2 nights, and hadn't said anything because he thought he was losing his mind. We shut down operations for the night and called the company supervisor. Told him we were having equipment problems and needed a safety inspection. It wasn't exactly a lie. Hearing dead people talk to you definitely counts as a safety issue. The next morning, the day crew reported that they'd found large footprints around the rig site. Not human, not quite animal either. They formed a rough circle around our work area, like something had been patrolling the perimeter all night. Ray had seen enough. He called the main office and requested an immediate crew rotation. Told them we'd been working too many consecutive shifts and needed a break before someone got hurt. The company wasn't happy about the disruption, but they agreed to send in a replacement crew. Before we left, Ray had a conversation with Jake Morrison, the local landowner who was getting royalty payments from the well. Jake had lived in the area his whole life, and when Ray described what we'd been experiencing, Jake just nodded like he wasn't surprised. "Yeah, there's been stories about this section for years," Jake told us. "My grandfather used to say there were things out here that weren't quite right. Most folks just avoid working this ground after dark." Jake mentioned that the previous oil company that had tried to drill in this area back in the 1980s had pulled out after only 2 weeks. Said their workers were spooked by weird incidents and kept quitting. I finished out my contract with the company, but I requested assignment to day shifts only. Told them I had family obligations that made night work difficult. Ray did the same thing, transferred to a different field entirely. The replacement crew lasted about 10 days before they also requested a transfer. After that, the company brought in workers from Texas who didn't know the local stories. They completed the well, but it took twice as long as expected because they had trouble keeping consistent crews. I still work in the oil patch, but I'm more careful about which jobs I take. There's good money in remote locations, but some places are remote for a reason. When local people have stories about avoiding an area after dark, it's probably worth listening to them. Story 5. The Archaeological Site. This happened 4 years ago when I was 19, during my sophomore year studying anthropology at the University of New Mexico. I'd gotten a spot on a Summerfield school excavating a prehistoric ancestral Puebloan site in the Four Corners region, about 3 hours north of Albuquerque. It was exactly the kind of hands-on experience I needed for my degree, and I was excited to be working on a real archaeological dig. The site was located on Bureau of Land Management property in a remote canyon, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive road that took about 40 minutes to navigate. We were excavating what appeared to be a seasonal camp used by hunter-gatherers about 800 years ago. Fire hearths, tool-making areas, and food processing sites scattered along a creek bottom. Our team consisted of 6 students and 2 professors, Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Mike Rodriguez, both experienced southwestern archaeologists. We'd set up a field camp about a half-mile from the excavation site, with tents, a kitchen area, and a storage tent for artifacts and equipment. The work schedule was pretty standard for field archaeology. We'd start digging at sunrise to avoid the worst heat of the day, take a long break during midday, then work until about 6 p.m. Evenings were spent processing artifacts, updating the field notes, and planning the next day's excavations. Everything was going smoothly for the first week. We were uncovering some interesting material: stone tools, pottery sherds, fire-cracked rock from cooking activities. The professors were pleased with our progress, and I was learning a lot about proper excavation techniques. The first weird thing happened during my night watch duty. We rotated security shifts to make sure nobody messed with our equipment, which unfortunately did happen sometimes at remote sites. I was doing a midnight patrol when I noticed that someone had been digging in one of our completed units. Unit 12 had been carefully backfilled and marked with flags the previous day, but now there was a fresh hole about 2 feet deep, right in the center of our excavation grid. The dirt was piled neatly to one side, and the hole was perfectly round, like it had been dug with a post-hole digger. I woke Dr. Chen to show her, and she was as puzzled as I was. There were no footprints around the area, and our equipment hadn't been disturbed. We covered the hole with a tarp and decided to investigate further in the morning. The next day, we found similar holes in 3 other units, all perfectly round, about 2 feet deep, and dug with precision that suggested someone with archaeological experience. But there was no sign of whoever had done the digging, and nothing had been taken from our artifact storage. Dr. Rodriguez contacted the local BLM ranger to report possible site disturbance, but the ranger said they hadn't seen any unauthorized vehicles in the area. He suggested we might be dealing with pot hunters, people who illegally dig up artifacts to sell, but couldn't explain why they would just dig holes without taking anything. That night, I volunteered for watch duty again, determined to catch whoever was messing with our site. I set up with a sleeping bag and thermos of coffee in a position where I could see both the excavation area and our camp. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing sounds from the direction of the dig site. Not human sounds, more like animals digging, but with a rhythm that seemed too organized. I grabbed my flashlight and headed over to investigate, moving as quietly as possible through the sagebrush. What I saw didn't make sense. There were 3 figures working in our excavation units, but they weren't human. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that suggested they were more comfortable on all fours than standing upright. They were using their hands to dig, but their hands looked more like claws, and they were working with a coordination that suggested they'd done this before. As I watched, they carefully removed dirt from specific areas, examined what they found, then either kept digging or moved to a different spot. I tried to get closer to see better, but I stepped on a dead branch that cracked loudly. All three figures immediately stopped digging and looked in my direction. In the dim starlight, I could see their faces were not quite human, elongated, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam. For about 10 seconds, we all just stared at each other. Then one of them made a sound, not a growl or a howl, but something that sounded almost like speech in a language I didn't recognize. The other two responded with similar sounds, and all three of them moved away from the excavation site, disappearing into the darkness with a fluidity that suggested they knew the terrain extremely well. I went back to camp and woke the professors. When I tried to explain what I'd seen, Dr. Chen looked skeptical, but Dr. Rodriguez seemed more concerned. He grabbed a flashlight and insisted we check the site immediately. We found fresh digging in 5 different units, but unlike the random holes from previous nights, these excavations were precisely targeted. Whatever these things were, they'd gone straight to the areas where we'd been finding the most significant artifacts. They'd even reopened some sections we thought were completely excavated. Dr. Rodriguez examined the digging techniques and shook his head. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone knows exactly what they're looking for and where to find it." The next morning, he made some phone calls to colleagues and to local tribal representatives. The site was on public land, but it was near traditional use areas for several Native American groups, and professional protocol required consultation on any unusual circumstances. One of the tribal cultural resource specialists, a woman named Mary Begay, drove out to meet with us that afternoon. When Dr. Rodriguez described what had been happening, her expression became serious. "You should pack up and leave," she told us directly. "This area has a history. People don't camp here overnight." She wouldn't go into details, but she mentioned that there were traditional stories about this particular canyon, and that local people avoided it after dark. She offered to help us relocate the field school to a different site. Dr. Chen wanted to continue the excavation, arguing that we had permits and were conducting legitimate research. But Dr. Rodriguez decided we should listen to Mary's advice. He'd worked in the Southwest long enough to respect local knowledge, especially when it came to areas with cultural significance. We spent the next day carefully documenting what we'd found and backfilling our excavation units. As we were packing up, Mary returned with an older man she introduced as her grandfather, who spoke to us in English, mixed with what I later learned was Navajo. He didn't provide many details, but he confirmed that the canyon had always been known as a place where things that weren't quite human would sometimes be seen. He thanked us for being respectful and leaving, and said that the area would be watched to make sure the disturbances stopped. We relocated the field school to a site near Chaco Canyon, where we completed the summer program without further incident. The original site was eventually designated as off-limits for future archaeological work, officially due to consultation issues with local tribes. I finished my degree and went on to graduate school. But I never forgot that night in the canyon. I've worked on a lot of archaeological sites since then, including several in remote areas. But I always make sure to check with local communities before setting up camp. There's a lot of knowledge that doesn't make it into academic papers, and sometimes the people who've lived in an area for generations know things that are worth listening to. Story 6. The Power Line Crew. This happened 18 months ago when I was 29. I was working for a utility contractor, part of a crew that specialized in maintaining high-voltage transmission lines in remote areas. The job I'm talking about took place in eastern Montana, where we were upgrading insulators and replacing worn hardware on a line that ran through about 60 miles of ranch country. Our crew consisted of 4 guys: myself, Brad, our foreman, Luis, another lineman with about 10 years experience, and Jake, who was fresh out of apprenticeship school. We were living in a construction trailer parked near the work zone, since the nearest town was over an hour away, and it didn't make sense to drive back and forth every day. The transmission line we were working on carried power from a coal plant near Billings to substations in North Dakota. It was critical infrastructure, so we were working under tight deadlines and couldn't afford delays. The towers were spaced about a quarter-mile apart across rolling prairie, connected by 3 wire phases carrying 345,000 volts. We'd been on the job for about a week when we started noticing that some of our work sites had been disturbed overnight. Nothing major. Tools moved around, safety equipment repositioned, that sort of thing. Brad figured it was probably curious cattle or maybe coyotes investigating our gear. The work itself was routine but demanding. Each morning, we'd load our truck with the day's equipment and drive to whatever tower was next on the schedule. The actual work required 2 guys to climb the tower, while the other 2 handled ground operations, hoisting materials and managing safety protocols. Jake was having some trouble adjusting to the isolation. He was from Billings originally and wasn't used to being out in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and nobody around for miles. He kept talking about hearing weird sounds at night and complaining that he felt like something was watching us work. Brad and Luis had been doing this kind of work for years, so they were used to remote locations and the way your mind could play tricks on you when you spent too much time in empty country. They told Jake it was normal to feel jumpy until you got used to the surroundings. But after about 10 days on the job, I started noticing things that made me think Jake might not be wrong. When we'd arrive at a work site in the morning, there would sometimes be tracks around the base of the transmission towers, not cattle tracks, and not quite right for coyotes either. They looked almost like bare human footprints, but larger than normal, and with the toes spread wider than you'd expect. The tracks always seemed to circle the towers, sometimes multiple times, like something had been inspecting our work from the previous day. We'd find them in soft dirt near the tower foundations, but they never extended far from the immediate work area. Luis mentioned it to Brad, who took a look but didn't seem too concerned. He'd worked on lines all over the West and said you saw all kinds of weird things in remote areas. Probably just some local wildlife they weren't familiar with. The situation escalated during our second week on the job. We were working on a tower about 30 miles from the main highway, in an area where the transmission line crossed a series of low ridges, covered with sagebrush and scattered pine trees. Jake was up on the tower with me, replacing insulators, when he suddenly stopped working and stared off toward the horizon. "There's someone watching us," he said, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile away. I looked in that direction, but didn't see anything except trees and rocks. Brad and Luis, who were on the ground handling our equipment, also scanned the area with binoculars but couldn't spot whatever Jake was talking about. "Probably just a rancher checking on his property," Brad called up to us. "Keep working." But Jake was visibly shaken. He said he could clearly see a figure standing among the trees, just watching our work. He described it as unusually tall and thin, wearing dark clothing, but too far away to make out any details. We finished the work on that tower and moved to the next one, but Jake kept looking back toward the ridge. He swore the figure was following us, staying about the same distance away, but moving to maintain a line of sight to our location. That night, back at our construction trailer, Jake barely slept. He said he could hear someone walking around outside, circling our campsite. The rest of us didn't hear anything unusual, but Jake was so insistent that Brad finally went out with a flashlight to check around. Brad found more of those strange footprints in the dirt around our trailer. They formed a complete circle, about 50 feet in diameter, with our trailer at the center. The prints were clear and fresh, definitely made sometime after we'd gone to bed. Okay, that's weird, Brad admitted when he came back inside. But it's probably just some local person who's curious about what we're doing out here, maybe concerned about us working on their land. The next day, we were working on a tower that required some complicated rigging to replace a damaged crossarm. I was up on the structure with Luis when we both heard Jake, who was on the ground, call up to us. "Hey, there's a guy down here who wants to talk to you." We looked down, but Jake was alone next to our truck. No sign of anyone else in the area. When we asked him about it over the radio, Jake sounded confused. He insisted that someone had just been talking to him, asking questions about our work and how long we'd be in the area. "What did he look like?" Brad asked. "I don't know," Jake replied. "Tall guy, but I couldn't really see his face clearly. He was standing in the shadow of the truck." But we'd been watching the ground the whole time. There had been no one down there except Jake. That's when Brad decided we needed to have a serious conversation about safety. He called us down from the tower and gathered everyone for a meeting. The official position was that Jake was experiencing stress from working in an isolated environment, which wasn't uncommon for new workers. But privately, Brad was starting to have his own concerns. He'd noticed that our work sites were being visited regularly by whatever was leaving those tracks, and some of the equipment disturbances were becoming more complex. Tools not just moved, but carefully arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random animal activity. The final incident happened 2 days before we were scheduled to complete the job. We were working on the last tower in the series, which was located on a high ridge that gave us a commanding view of the surrounding country for miles in every direction. I was about 60 feet up, installing new hardware, when I saw something that made me stop working and stare. About a mile away, moving across the prairie toward our location, were 3 figures walking in single file. Even at that distance, there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too fluid, too fast for the rough terrain they were crossing. I called down to the crew and pointed them out. Luis climbed up to my level with binoculars and confirmed what I was seeing. The figures were moving directly toward our tower, maintaining perfect spacing and coordination. "They're not human," Luis said after watching them for several minutes. "Look how they move." He was right. The figures seemed to flow across the landscape, covering ground much faster than walking humans should be able to manage. And their proportions were wrong. Too tall, too lean, with an odd gait that suggested they were more comfortable on all fours than walking upright. Brad made the decision to pack up and leave immediately. We descended from the tower, loaded our equipment as quickly as possible, and drove away from the work site. As we left, I looked back and saw the 3 figures standing exactly where our truck had been parked, watching us drive away. We returned the next morning with additional crew members from the main office, but found no sign of the figures. The work site was undisturbed, and we were able to complete the job without further incident. But all of us requested different assignments for our next projects. Brad, who had 20 years of experience working remote transmission lines, told me later that he'd never encountered anything like what we experienced in Montana. He transferred to a different division that focused on suburban power lines, and Lewis moved to a job with a different company entirely. Jake left the electrical trade altogether. Last I heard, he was working construction in Billings, strictly day shifts and only on projects within city limits. I still work on transmission lines, but I'm more selective about remote assignments. There are some places where the work just doesn't feel right, and I've learned to trust those instincts. Sometimes the extra money for isolated jobs isn't worth whatever you might encounter out there in the empty country. The Story 7. The Fire Lookout. This happened 3 summers ago when I was 26. I'd gotten a job with the Forest Service working as a fire lookout in the Gila National Forest in southwestern New Mexico. It was exactly the kind of summer work I'd been looking for. Good pay, beautiful location, and plenty of time to work on my novel when things were quiet. The lookout tower was located on Bear Mountain, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. It was a traditional steel tower, about 40 feet tall, with a small cabin at the top, equipped with radio equipment, maps, and basic living facilities. My job was to watch for smoke, report any signs of fire activity, and provide weather observations twice daily. I was replacing an older guy named Tom Hendricks, who'd been working lookouts for the Forest Service for over 15 years. When he showed me around the facilities, he seemed eager to finish the orientation and get out of there. He covered all the technical aspects of the job quickly and efficiently, but he didn't spend much time on casual conversation. As he was preparing to leave, Tom paused at the base of the tower and looked up at the cabin. "You might hear things at night," he told me. "Sounds that don't make sense for the location. Just ignore them and focus on your job." I asked him what he meant, but he just said that remote locations could play tricks on your mind, especially when you were alone for weeks at a time. He advised me to keep busy during the evening hours and make sure I maintained regular radio contact with the dispatch center. The first week went smoothly. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and I quickly settled into a routine of scanning the horizon with binoculars, recording weather data, and checking in with dispatch every few hours. The isolation was actually refreshing after months of working in crowded city environments. The fire danger was moderate for early June, and I spotted a few small smoke columns that turned out to be prescribed burns or controlled campfires. The radio traffic was routine, mostly weather reports and status updates from other lookouts scattered throughout the forest. During my second week, I started noticing that someone was visiting the tower at night. I'd wake up in the morning and find footprints around the base of the structure, bare human footprints that circled the tower several times before heading off into the forest. The prints were larger than mine and showed an unusual gait pattern, as if whoever was making them was walking on the balls of their feet rather than using a normal heel-to-toe stride. They appeared fresh each morning, but I never heard anyone approaching during the night. I mentioned it during my daily radio check, and the dispatcher told me it might be backpackers using the tower as a navigation landmark. The area was popular with hikers, and people sometimes got turned around in the backcountry and used prominent features like fire towers to regain their bearings. But the footprints always appeared alone, never accompanied by boot prints or any sign of camping gear. And they always followed the same pattern. Multiple circles around the tower base, then a straight line leading into the forest toward the northwest. During my third week, I decided to stay awake one night and see if I could spot whoever was leaving the tracks. I set up in the tower cabin with all the lights off using my night vision scope to watch the area around the base of the structure. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A tall figure emerged from the tree line and walked directly toward the tower. Even through the night scope, there was something unsettling about the way it moved. Too fluid, too silent for someone walking across rocky ground in the dark. The figure circled the tower 3 times, just like the footprints had suggested, but it wasn't just walking. It seemed to be examining the structure, reaching up to touch the steel supports and looking up toward my cabin. When it finished circling, it stood directly beneath me for several minutes, perfectly still. I tried to get a better look at its face, but the angle was wrong, and the night vision scope wasn't powerful enough to make out details. What I could see was that it was unusually tall, probably over 7 feet, with long arms and legs that gave it an almost skeletal appearance. After about 10 minutes, it walked away from the tower toward the northwest, moving with the same fluid gait I'd observed earlier. I watched until it disappeared into the forest, then spent the rest of the night wondering what I'd just witnessed. The next morning, I found the usual footprints, but this time they were accompanied by handprints on the tower's steel supports. The handprints were larger than normal, with fingers that seemed longer and thinner than human proportions would suggest. I took photos of the prints and reported the incident during my radio check. The dispatcher sounded concerned and said they'd send someone up to investigate, but it would take a day or 2 to arrange for personnel to make the hike. That night, I heard sounds that definitely weren't normal forest noise. Around midnight, I started hearing what sounded like conversation coming from the area around the tower base. Multiple voices speaking in low tones, but I couldn't make out any words or even identify the language. I looked out the windows but couldn't see anything in the darkness. The voices continued for about an hour, sometimes seeming to move around the clearing, sometimes appearing to come from directly below the tower cabin. The conversation had a rhythm that suggested question and answer, as if several individuals were discussing something important. But whenever I tried to focus on individual words or phrases, they seemed to slip away, like trying to remember a dream after waking up. Around 1 a.m., one of the voices called up toward my cabin. It was my name, David, but spoken by someone I didn't recognize. The voice was too deep, with an accent or inflection that didn't sound quite human. I didn't respond, but the voice repeated my name several more times, each repetition coming from a different location around the tower. Finally, a different voice, higher pitched but equally strange, asked, "David, why won't you come down and talk to us?" I stayed in the cabin with all the lights off and didn't answer. After about 30 minutes, the voices gradually faded away, and the forest returned to normal nighttime sounds. The Forest Service investigator arrived 2 days later. Ray Martinez was an experienced backcountry ranger who'd worked in the Gila for over 20 years. I showed him the photographs and described what I'd been experiencing. Ray examined the footprints and handprints carefully, then walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any other signs of unusual activity. When he finished his investigation, he sat down with me to discuss his findings. "I've seen similar things at other remote installations," he told me, "usually fire towers or weather stations, places where someone's working alone for extended periods. The official explanation is that isolation can cause people to misinterpret normal sounds and shadows." But then he lowered his voice and added, "Off the record, this area has a history. The local Apache groups have traditional stories about this mountain, things that go back generations. Most of the old-timers who work for the Forest Service know to respect those stories." Ray suggested that I might want to request a transfer to a different lookout, or at least ask for a partner assignment. He said the Forest Service had policies about lone workers in remote areas, especially when there were safety concerns. I finished out my commitment for that summer, but I never had another encounter like the one during my 3rd week. The footprints and handprints stopped appearing, and I didn't hear any more nighttime conversations. When I filed my end-of-season report, I focused on fire detection activities and weather observations. I didn't include details about the unusual incidents, but I did mention that the location might not be suitable for single-person assignments. The next summer, the Forest Service staffed that lookout with a 2-person team. I never found out if they experienced anything similar, but I heard through the grapevine that they requested additional equipment for nighttime security. I still work seasonal jobs with the Forest Service, but I prefer assignments that involve working with crews rather than solo positions. There's something to be said for having other people around when you're spending weeks in remote locations. Some places are just too isolated for one person to handle alone. Story 8. The Hunting Guide. This happened 5 years ago when I was 24. I was working as a hunting guide in the remote backcountry of northwestern Wyoming, taking clients after elk and mule deer in an area about 50 miles from the nearest paved road. The outfit I worked for specialized in backcountry hunts, week-long trips where we'd pack in on horseback and set up spike camps miles from civilization. My partner that season was an older guide named Frank Yazzie, a Navajo guy who'd been hunting and guiding in the region for over 30 years. Frank knew the country better than anyone and had a reputation for finding game when other guides couldn't. He was also one of the most level-headed people I'd ever met, not given to tall tales or superstitious thinking. We were guiding 2 clients from Texas, businessmen who wanted a genuine backcountry experience and were willing to pay for it. The hunt was scheduled for 10 days in late September, during the peak of elk season, in an area that required a 4-hour horseback ride to reach from our base camp. The country we were hunting was spectacular. High meadows surrounded by dense timber with plenty of game sign and clear streams running through the valleys. It was the kind of place that reminded you why people fall in love with the wilderness, miles from any road or development. Our spike camp was set up in a meadow at about 9,000 feet elevation, with wall tents for sleeping and a kitchen area under a tarp. We had enough supplies for the full 10 days, plus extra in case weather forced us to stay longer than planned. The first few days of the hunt went well. We were seeing elk regularly, and both clients were getting opportunities for shots. Frank was in his element, reading sign and predicting animal movement with an accuracy that came from decades of experience in the mountains. On our 4th day, we found something that made Frank stop and study the ground for a long time. We were following a game trail through thick timber when he dismounted and called me over to look at tracks in a muddy section of the trail. Mixed in with the normal elk and deer prints were what looked like bare human footprints, but much larger than normal and with an unusual shape. The heel was narrow, and the toes were spread wider than you'd expect from someone walking barefoot in rough country. "That's not human," Frank said quietly, examining the tracks carefully. "But it's not any animal I recognize either." The tracks showed someone or something walking upright, with a stride length that suggested a height of 7 feet or more. They followed the game trail for about 100 yards before disappearing on rocky ground. Frank seemed troubled by the discovery, but he didn't offer much explanation. He just said we should be more careful and make sure we stay together when moving through heavy timber. That evening, back at camp, I asked Frank directly what he thought about the tracks. He was quiet for a long time before answering. There are things in these mountains that don't fit normal categories, he finally said. My grandfather told me stories about them when I was growing up. Most people dismiss that kind of talk, but when you spend as much time in the backcountry as I have, you learn to keep an open mind. He didn't go into details, but he suggested we might want to consider moving our camp to a different location. The area we were in felt unsettled to him, though he couldn't specify exactly why. The clients were having a great hunt and didn't want to relocate, so we stayed put. But Frank insisted on some additional precautions. No one was to leave camp alone after dark, and we'd take turns staying awake during the night to tend the fire and keep watch. The second strange incident happened 2 days later. We were hunting a ridge about 3 miles from camp when one of our clients, a guy named Jim, claimed he heard someone calling his name from the timber below us. He was certain it was his wife's voice, asking him to come down and help her. The problem was that Jim's wife was back in Houston, and there was no way she could be wandering around the Wyoming wilderness. When Frank and I listened carefully, we could hear what Jim was talking about, a voice that did sound like a woman calling for help, but it didn't sound quite right. Frank immediately started moving us away from the area. "We need to go back to camp," he said firmly. "Now." As we rode away, I could hear the voice following us, sometimes calling Jim's name, sometimes calling mine or Frank's. It always sounded like someone in distress, but there was something artificial about it, like a recording played through a bad speaker. That night, Frank told us more about what he thought we might be dealing with. He'd heard stories from his grandfather and other tribal elders about entities that could mimic human voices to lure people away from safety. They were associated with remote areas where traditional boundaries between worlds were thin. The old people had rules about how to deal with them, Frank explained. You don't respond to voices calling from the forest. You don't follow sounds that don't make sense for the location. And you never, ever go off alone when you know they're around. The final encounter happened on our 8th day. We were breaking camp to move to a different area when Jim's horse suddenly spooked and threw him. The horse, normally calm and reliable, was acting like it had seen a predator, snorting and trying to bolt despite Frank's attempts to calm it. All 4 horses were reacting the same way, looking toward a dense grove of aspens about 50 yards from our campsite. Frank grabbed his binoculars and studied the area carefully. "There's something in there," he said quietly. "Something big." Through the binoculars, I could see a tall figure standing among the aspen trees, partially obscured by the white trunks and golden leaves. It was definitely not human. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that suggested something that normally moved on all 4s, but was currently standing upright. As we watched, it stepped out from behind the trees and looked directly at us. The face was wrong, elongated, with features that combined human and animal characteristics. The eyes were too large and reflected the morning sunlight like an animal's. For about 30 seconds, we all stared at each other. Then Frank quietly told us to load our gear and prepare to leave immediately. No sudden movements, no loud noises, just calm, deliberate preparation for departure. The thing watched us pack, occasionally tilting its head like it was trying to understand what we were doing. When we mounted our horses and began riding away, it followed us for about a mile, staying just inside the tree line, but keeping pace with our group. Frank led us out of the area by a different route than we'd used coming in, taking game trails and ridgeline paths that avoided the heavy timber where we'd been seeing sign. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail that led back to our base camp. The clients were shaken, but handled the situation better than I expected. Frank explained that they'd encountered something unusual, but not necessarily dangerous, as long as we respected its territory and didn't try to pursue or provoke it. When we got back to civilization, Frank reported the incident to the Forest Service and the outfitter who employed us. He was careful to describe it in terms of unusual wildlife behavior, rather than anything that would sound too far-fetched for official reports. The hunting area was quietly removed from our outfit's rotation for the rest of that season. The official reason was increased predator activity, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. I continued working as a guide for several more years, but I always appreciated Frank's knowledge and experience when it came to reading sign and understanding animal behavior. He taught me that there are things in the backcountry that don't fit standard categories, and that respecting traditional knowledge can sometimes keep you out of trouble. Frank retired a couple of years ago, but he still takes private clients into areas he knows well. He's selective about the locations he'll guide in, and he always makes sure his clients understand the importance of following his lead when it comes to safety in remote areas. Story 9. The Weather Station. This happened 2 years ago when I was 25. I was working for the National Weather Service, maintaining automated weather stations scattered across remote areas of eastern Oregon. It was a good job for someone who didn't mind driving long distances and working alone. Most of the stations were in locations where you might not see another person for days. The station I'm talking about was located on a high plateau, about 80 miles southeast of Burns, in an area that was mostly public land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The facility consisted of a small equipment shelter, a radio tower, and various instruments for measuring temperature, humidity, wind speed, and precipitation. My job was to visit each station monthly, download data, perform routine maintenance, and replace any equipment that wasn't functioning properly. This particular station, designated OR 247, was at the end of a rough dirt road that took about 90 minutes to navigate from the nearest highway. The area around OR 247 was typical high desert, sagebrush, scattered juniper trees, and vast open spaces with visibility for miles in every direction. The elevation was about 4,500 feet, which meant it could get cold even during summer nights, and winter conditions were harsh enough that the station was sometimes inaccessible for months at a time. I'd been servicing OR 247 for about 6 months without any problems. The equipment was relatively new, the solar power system worked reliably, and the remote data transmission was functioning normally. It was actually one of the easier stations on my route. The first unusual thing I noticed was that the station's perimeter fence had been damaged. The chain link barrier that protected the equipment from livestock and wildlife had several sections that appeared to have been pushed in from the outside, as if something large had been trying to get closer to the instruments. There were no cattle in the immediate area, and the damage didn't look like it had been caused by the elk or deer that occasionally wandered through. The fence posts were bent at angles that suggested something much stronger than normal wildlife had been testing the barriers. I repaired the fence and made a note in my maintenance log, thinking it was probably wind damage or possibly someone driving a vehicle too close to the installation. The station continued to function normally, and the data it was transmitting looked consistent with other nearby facilities. About a month later, during my next service visit, I found more fence damage, but this time there were also signs that someone had been interfering with the equipment. The weather instruments hadn't been damaged, but they'd been repositioned. The wind vane was pointing in a different direction, and the rain gauge had been moved several feet from its original location. More puzzling, the data logger showed gaps in the recorded information. Several hours of measurements were missing, not because of equipment failure, but because the instruments had apparently been disconnected and then reconnected. The timestamps showed the interruptions had occurred during nighttime hours. I contacted my supervisor to report possible vandalism, but he said the location was too remote for casual troublemakers. He suggested it might be researchers from one of the universities conducting their own studies and borrowing our equipment temporarily. But there were no research permits on file for that area, and any legitimate scientist would have contacted the Weather Service before interfering with our instruments. Plus, the way the equipment had been handled suggested someone who wasn't familiar with proper measurement procedures. During my third visit to OR 247, I decided to spend the night at the station and see if I could catch whoever was messing with our equipment. I brought camping gear and parked my truck near the equipment shelter, planning to keep watch during the overnight hours. The high desert can be eerily quiet at night, especially when there's no wind. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing sounds that didn't fit the normal background noise. Footsteps on gravel, but with an irregular rhythm that suggested someone moving carefully to avoid detection. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. The sounds stopped immediately, but I could sense that something was nearby. The feeling of being watched was so strong that I actually checked to make sure my truck doors were unlocked in case I needed to get inside quickly. Around midnight, I heard voices coming from the direction of the weather instruments. Low conversation, multiple people talking, but I couldn't make out any words. When I tried to get closer to investigate, the voices stopped. I spent the next hour moving around the perimeter of the station, trying to locate whoever was out there, but I never saw anyone. The voices would resume whenever I returned to my camping spot, but they'd stop the moment I tried to approach. Around 2 a.m., one of the voices called my name. Michael, clear as anything, in what sounded like my supervisor's voice. Michael, we need you to come look at something. That didn't make sense. My supervisor was back in Boise, and he had no reason to be wandering around the high desert in the middle of the night. But the voice was perfect. His inflection, his tone, everything. Michael, the equipment is malfunctioning. We need your help. I stayed where I was, but the voice continued calling, sometimes from different locations around the station. Eventually, other voices joined in. Co-workers, family members, people I knew, all asking me to come help with various problems that supposedly needed immediate attention. The weird part was that some of the voices were people I hadn't talked to in months, but they were using information about my work and personal life that seemed current and accurate. One voice, claiming to be my ex-girlfriend, mentioned specific details about my job that she shouldn't have known. I spent the rest of the night in my truck with the doors locked, trying to ignore the voices that continued calling from the darkness around the weather station. They finally stopped around dawn, when the normal desert sounds of birds and insects resumed. When I examined the equipment the next morning, I found that all the instruments had been carefully adjusted and recalibrated. Whoever or whatever had been messing with them during the night had actually improved their accuracy and alignment. The data logger showed perfect measurements for the entire night, with no gaps or interruptions. But my truck's electronic systems had malfunctioned several times. The radio had switched stations on its own, and the GPS had lost signal repeatedly despite clear skies. I filed a report with my supervisor, focusing on the technical aspects of the equipment tampering and the electronic malfunctions. I didn't mention the voices or the feeling of being watched, but I did recommend that future service visits to OR 247 be conducted by two-person teams. About a week later, I got a call from a colleague who worked in a different district. He'd heard about my report and wanted to compare notes. Turned out he'd experienced similar incidents at remote weather stations in Nevada and Idaho. Equipment mysteriously adjusted, electronic interference, and what he described as unexplained nighttime activity. He'd done some research and found that several other weather service technicians had reported similar experiences over the years, usually at stations in very isolated locations. The common factors seem to be remote desert or mountain settings, clear night skies, and equipment that operated on radio frequencies. His theory was that the weather stations might be attracting attention from something that was curious about or sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. The instruments were constantly transmitting data, and the radio towers were some of the most prominent man-made structures in otherwise empty landscapes. I continued servicing OR 247 for the rest of my time with the weather service, but I never spent the night there again. I arranged my route so that I could arrive in the morning and finish the work before dark. The station continued to function normally, and I never had any more problems with equipment tampering. When I left that job to take a position with a private meteorology company, I made sure to brief my replacement about the unusual aspects of OR 247. I told him about the fence damage and the equipment adjustments, and suggested he avoid overnight stays at that location. I heard later that the Weather Service eventually installed additional security equipment at OR 247, including motion-activated cameras and upgraded communication systems. I never found out if the cameras caught anything interesting, but the station continues to operate normally and provide valuable weather data for the region. Story 10. The Ranch Hand. This happened last spring when I was 28. I was working as a ranch hand on a large cattle operation in southeastern Colorado, about 30 miles from the nearest town of Kim. The ranch covered nearly 50,000 acres of high plains country, rolling grassland, dotted with stock tanks, windmills, and scattered patches of yucca and prickly pear cactus. My job involved everything from fixing fence to moving cattle, but my main responsibility was checking the remote pastures and water sources that were too far from the main headquarters for daily supervision. I'd drive out in a pickup truck, sometimes staying overnight in a small line camp if the work required multiple days. The ranch had been in the same family for 4 generations, and the current owner, Jim Morrison, was a 3rd-generation rancher who knew every section of the property. Jim was a practical man who didn't waste time on anything that didn't directly relate to raising cattle. But he'd grown up hearing stories from his grandfather about strange things that occasionally happened in the remote corners of the ranch. The particular area I'm talking about was called the North Section, a 5,000-acre pasture that bordered the Comanche National Grassland. It was good grazing country, but it was far enough from headquarters that we only checked it thoroughly about once a week during the summer grazing season. I'd been working on the ranch for about 3 months when Jim asked me to spend a few days in the North Section, fixing fence and checking on a windmill that hadn't been pumping properly. There was a small line camp there, basically a one-room cabin with a wood stove and basic supplies that I could use as a base of operations. The work itself was straightforward. The fence needed about a mile of new wire where cattle had pushed through, and the windmill required a new pump rod and some bearing maintenance. I figured I could finish both jobs in 2 days if the weather cooperated. The first day went smoothly. I spent the morning working on fence and the afternoon on the windmill. The country was beautiful in that stark high plains way. Endless grassland under a huge sky, with thunderheads building on the horizon and meadowlarks calling from fence posts. That evening, I was cooking dinner at the line camp when I noticed that the cattle in the nearby pasture were acting strangely. Instead of being scattered across the grassland like normal, they'd all bunched up in the southeast corner of the section, as far from the line camp as they could get while staying within the fenced area. Cattle sometimes bunch up when there's a predator around, but I couldn't see any sign of coyotes or the occasional mountain lion that wandered up from the canyons to the south. The animals seemed nervous but not panicked, just reluctant to spread out and graze normally. I walked out toward the herd to see if I could figure out what was bothering them, but they moved away as I approached, maintaining about the same distance from the line camp. When I gave up and went back to the cabin, they gradually settled down, but stayed in their tight group. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of something large walking around outside the cabin. Heavy footsteps on the wooden porch, then the sound of something testing the door handle. I lay still and listened. Whatever it was circled the building, pausing at each window as if looking inside. I had a rifle with me, standard equipment for ranch work in case of predator problems, but I didn't want to start shooting at something I couldn't identify. The footsteps were too heavy for a coyote and didn't sound quite right for a person walking normally. After about 10 minutes, the sounds moved away from the cabin toward the stock tank, about 100 yards to the north. I could hear splashing, like something drinking or wading in the water. But the sounds lasted much longer than any normal animal would spend at a water source. The next morning, I found tracks around the cabin and leading to the stock tank. They looked like bare human footprints, but they were larger than mine and showed an unusual gait pattern. The stride length was longer than normal, and the impressions suggested someone walking on the balls of their feet rather than using a normal heel-to-toe step. Around the stock tank, the tracks became confused, as if whatever made them had spent considerable time moving back and forth along the water's edge. There were also what looked like handprints in the mud, but with fingers that seemed too long and thin for normal human proportions. I called Jim on the radio to report the incident, describing it in terms of possible trespassing, rather than anything that might sound too unusual. Jim said he'd had similar reports from other hands over the years, and suggested I finish my work quickly and return to headquarters. But I had another full day of fence work ahead of me, and I didn't want to leave the job half finished. Jim understood the work ethic, but he insisted I check in by radio every few hours and return to headquarters if I had any more problems. The second day started normally enough. I worked on fence all morning, replacing wire and tightening posts. The cattle were still bunched up in the same area, but they seemed less agitated than the previous day. Around noon, I took a break for lunch and noticed that someone had been messing with my truck. The vehicle hadn't been damaged, but the contents had been gone through systematically. My toolbox was reorganized, with everything neatly arranged by size and function. My lunch cooler had been opened and examined, but nothing was missing. Even my spare clothes had been refolded and stacked in a precise pile. What really got my attention was that someone had drawn in the dust on my windshield. Not random marks or graffiti, but what looked like a map of the immediate area, complete with landmarks like the stock tank the windmill, and the line camp. There was also a mark that might have represented my truck's location. I took photos of the drawing before cleaning it off, then spent about an hour checking the area for any sign of whoever had been examining my vehicle. I found more of the unusual footprints, but they led off across the grassland toward the north and disappeared in the rocky ground near the property boundary. That afternoon, while I was working on a particularly difficult section of fence, I heard someone calling my name from the direction of the line camp. Dave, clear as anything, in what sounded like Jim's voice. Dave, come back to the cabin. We need to talk. I could see the line camp from where I was working, about half a mile away, but there were no vehicles parked there, and no sign of anyone around the building. Jim was supposed to be in town that day, dealing with cattle buyers, and he wouldn't have hiked out to the north section without his truck. The voice continued calling, sometimes from the cabin, sometimes from other locations around the pasture. Dave, there's a problem with the cattle. Come back and help me check on them. But the cattle were visible from my work location, still bunched up in the southeast corner, and they seemed as nervous as ever. Whatever was calling my name wasn't concerned about the livestock. It wanted me to stop working and return to the cabin. I ignored the voices and continued working on fence until late afternoon. The calling stopped around 4 p.m., but I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched from somewhere nearby. Every time I looked up from my work, I'd scan the horizon for any sign of movement, but I never saw anything that didn't belong. As the sun was setting, I made the decision to pack up and drive back to headquarters, rather than spend another night at the line camp. I'd finished most of the fence work, and I could return to complete the job with a partner if necessary. While I was loading my tools, I heard the voices again, but this time they were coming from multiple directions around the pasture. Different people I knew, Jim, other ranch hands, family members, all asking me to stay and finish the work, or to come investigate various problems that supposedly needed immediate attention. One voice, claiming to be my girlfriend Lisa, said she was lost and needed help finding the main road. But Lisa was back in town, working her shift at the bank, and she'd never even been to the north section. I got in my truck and started driving toward headquarters, but the voices followed me for the first few miles. They seemed to be keeping pace with the vehicle, calling from the darkness on both sides of the ranch road. Sometimes they'd get ahead of me and call from the direction I was driving, as if trying to get me to stop and investigate. About halfway back to headquarters, the voices finally stopped, and I made the rest of the drive in normal silence. When I reached the main ranch compound, I found Jim in his office catching up on paperwork after his day in town. I gave him a straightforward report on the fence work and mentioned that I'd like to bring a partner when I returned to finish the job. Jim nodded and said that was probably a good idea, given the remote location and the amount of work still to be done. A few days later, I went back to the north section with another ranch hand, a guy named Carlos who'd been working on the ranch for over 10 years. We finished the fence work without any unusual incidents, though Carlos did comment that the area felt off somehow. The cattle sure don't like being out here, he observed as we worked. I've seen them bunch up around predators before, but this is different. They're scared of something, but they don't know where the threat is coming from. We completed the work in one day and returned to headquarters before dark. Carlos didn't ask any questions about why I'd requested a partner for what should have been a routine job, but he did mention that other hands had reported strange experiences in the north section over the years. Jim eventually moved the cattle out of that pasture earlier than usual and didn't use it again for the rest of that grazing season. When I asked him about it, he just said the grass wasn't recovering as well as he'd hoped, and he wanted to give it more time to rest. I continued working on the ranch for another year before taking a job closer to town. The pay was better at the ranch, but I preferred work that involved more regular human contact and less time in remote locations. Some places just don't feel right when you're there alone, and I'd learned to trust those instincts. Story 11. The Solar Farm Technician. This happened 6 months ago when I was 27. I was working as a maintenance technician for a large solar installation in the Mojave Desert, about 40 miles northeast of Barstow, California. The facility covered several square miles of desert with thousands of photovoltaic panels arranged in long rows, all controlled by a centralized monitoring system. My job involved routine maintenance on the panels and electrical equipment, plus responding to system alerts that indicated problems with individual sections of the array. Most of the work was straightforward: cleaning panels, replacing faulty inverters, and checking electrical connections. The facility was completely automated and normally didn't require on-site personnel except for scheduled maintenance. But during the summer months, we had to station someone there overnight to respond to any system failures that might occur during peak heat conditions. I'd been working the night shift for about 3 weeks when I started noticing that some of the security cameras were picking up unusual activity. The motion detection system would trigger alerts, but when I checked the recorded footage, all I could see were brief glimpses of something large moving between the panel rows. At first, I figured it was probably coyotes or the occasional desert bighorn sheep that wandered down from the nearby mountains. The infrared cameras weren't high resolution enough to provide clear images, especially when something was moving quickly through the shadows cast by the solar panels. But the pattern of movement didn't look like normal wildlife behavior. Whatever was triggering the cameras seemed to be following the maintenance roads that ran between the panel arrays, moving in straight lines rather than the random patterns you'd expect from animals foraging or hunting. The facility's perimeter was secured with an 8-foot chain-link fence, topped with razor wire, more to keep out copper thieves than wildlife. But there were no signs that anyone had cut through or climbed over the barriers, and the main gate was equipped with electronic locks that kept a record of all entries and exits. During my 4th week on the night shift, I decided to investigate the motion alerts more actively. Instead of just checking the camera footage, I started driving around the facility in a utility vehicle whenever the detectors were triggered. The solar farm was laid out in a grid pattern, with wide maintenance roads running north-south and narrower access paths running east-west between the panel rows. During the day, you could see for miles across the desert, but at night, the panels created a maze of shadows that limited visibility to just a few yards in any direction. Around 2 a.m., I got a motion alert from Section 7, which was in the southwest corner of the facility, about half a mile from the control building where I was stationed. I drove out to investigate and found fresh tracks in the sand between 2 rows of panels. The tracks were unusual, larger than human footprints, but not quite the right shape for any desert animal I was familiar with. They showed someone or something walking upright with a stride length that suggested a height of over 7 feet. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile before they disappeared on the rocky ground near a wash that ran along the facility's western boundary. Along the way, I found several places where panels had been touched or examined, but there was no damage to the equipment. The next night, I had multiple motion alerts from different sections of the facility. Each time I investigated, I found similar tracks and evidence that someone had been moving systematically through the solar arrays, apparently studying the equipment without causing any harm. I reported the incidents to my supervisor, describing them as possible security breaches by someone interested in the facility's technology. The company took the report seriously and arranged for additional security cameras to be installed in the areas where I'd found the most activity. But the new cameras didn't provide any clearer images. Whatever was moving through the facility seemed to be aware of the camera locations and stayed just outside their effective range. Sometimes I'd get motion alerts from cameras that showed nothing but empty spaces between the panels. During my 6th week on the job, I had a direct encounter with whatever had been wandering around the solar farm. I was doing a routine check of the electrical systems in Section 12 when I heard footsteps on the gravel maintenance road behind me. I turned around and saw a tall figure standing about 50 yards away, silhouetted against the desert starlight. It was clearly not human, too tall, too thin, with proportions that suggested something that normally moved on all fours but was currently standing upright. We stared at each other for about 30 seconds. Then the figure tilted its head like it was trying to understand what I was and made a sound that was almost like speech, but in no language I recognized. I reached for my radio to call for assistance, and the movement seemed to startle the figure. It dropped to all fours and moved away between the panel rows with a fluid grace that reminded me of a large cat. But the size was all wrong for any predator that belonged in the desert. I followed the path it had taken, but by the time I reached the area where I'd last seen it, there was no sign of the figure, just more of those unusual tracks in the sand, leading toward the facility's eastern boundary. I filed a detailed report with my supervisor and the security company that monitored the facility. They reviewed all the camera footage from that night, but couldn't find any clear images of what I'd encountered. The company decided to install motion-activated floodlights throughout the facility and arrange for roving security patrols during the overnight hours. They also brought in a wildlife expert to examine the tracks and try to identify what kind of animal might be responsible. The expert was puzzled by the evidence. The tracks didn't match any known desert species, and the behavior pattern, systematic exploration of the facility without any apparent interest in food or water sources, wasn't consistent with normal wildlife activity. His best guess was that we might be dealing with an unusually large coyote or possibly a mountain lion that had learned to avoid the cameras, but he admitted that neither explanation fully accounted for all the evidence. After the security upgrades were installed, the motion alerts became much less frequent. Whatever had been exploring the facility seemed to be deterred by the additional lighting and human presence. I continued working at the solar farm for another 2 months before transferring to a day shift position at a different facility. The night work paid better, but I preferred assignments that didn't involve spending long hours alone in remote locations. My replacement lasted only 3 weeks before requesting a transfer. He reported similar experiences with unexplained motion alerts and the feeling of being watched while working alone among the solar panels. The company eventually decided to staff the facility with 2-person crews during overnight shifts. The official reason was enhanced security protocols, but the word among the technicians was that too many people were uncomfortable working alone at that particular location. I still work in renewable energy, but I stick to facilities that are closer to populated areas and have regular daytime staffing. There's something about being alone in the desert at night, surrounded by thousands of solar panels reflecting starlight, that makes you very aware of how isolated you really are. Story 12. The mining surveyor This happened 8 months ago when I was 23. I just finished my degree in mining engineering and landed a job with an exploration company that was evaluating mineral prospects throughout the Great Basin region of Nevada and Utah. The work involved a lot of travel to remote locations, taking soil samples and mapping geological formations. The particular site I'm talking about was an abandoned copper mine about 60 miles northwest of Ali, Nevada, in an area that had been actively mined during the early 1900s, but was shut down during the Great Depression. Our company had acquired mineral rights to the property and wanted to determine if modern extraction methods could make it profitable again. I was working with a partner, an experienced geologist named Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been evaluating mining properties for over 20 years. We were planning to spend 5 days at the site, taking samples and mapping the underground workings that were still accessible. The old mine consisted of several open pits connected by a network of tunnels that extended about 300 feet into the mountainside. Most of the surface buildings had collapsed decades ago, but the underground workings were still in decent condition, though we had to be careful about unstable areas and potential gas accumulation. We'd set up our base camp near the main mine entrance, with tents and equipment for collecting and analyzing samples. The location was spectacular in that high desert way. Rugged mountains, clear air, and views that stretched for miles across empty valleys dotted with sagebrush and scattered pine trees. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. We mapped the accessible tunnel systems and collected samples from ore veins that showed promising mineral content. Dr. Williams was experienced with abandoned mines and knew how to work safely in potentially dangerous underground conditions. On our third day, we noticed that someone had been disturbing our campsite during the night. Nothing was missing, but our equipment had been moved around and reorganized. Our sample bags were neatly stacked in piles, organized by the tunnel they'd come from, and our geological maps had been spread out and apparently studied. Dr. Williams thought it might be other prospectors, or perhaps researchers from a university, checking on our work. Mining claims in Nevada were public record, and it wasn't uncommon for multiple groups to be interested in the same properties. But there were no vehicle tracks leading to our campsite other than our own, and the nearest access road was over 10 miles away across rough terrain that would be difficult to navigate on foot, especially at night. That evening, we heard sounds coming from inside the mine tunnels. Not the normal settling sounds you'd expect from old workings, but what sounded like deliberate movement, footsteps, scraping sounds, and occasional impacts like someone or something bumping into the tunnel walls. Dr. Williams had worked in dozens of old mines and said the sounds weren't typical of structural issues or wildlife that sometimes took shelter in abandoned workings. The acoustics were wrong, and the timing suggested something moving purposefully through the underground passages. We decided to investigate the next morning, using our headlamps and portable gas detectors to safely explore the areas where we'd heard the sounds. The tunnels showed signs of recent use, disturbed dust, scuff marks on the walls, and what looked like bare footprints in the muddy areas where water seeped through the rock. The footprints were human-shaped but unusually large, with toes that were spread wider than normal. They appeared to follow the main tunnel system, sometimes branching off into side passages that we hadn't yet explored in detail. Dr. Williams was puzzled by the evidence. The mine had been sealed for decades, and there was no indication that anyone had been using it recently for mining or exploration purposes. The footprints were fresh, probably made within the last few days. That afternoon, while we were working in a tunnel about 200 feet from the entrance, Our headlamps began flickering and dimming despite having fresh batteries. The portable gas detector also started giving false readings, alternating between normal and alarm conditions, without any apparent cause. Then we started hearing voices echoing from deeper in the mine. Conversation between multiple people, speaking too low to understand the words, but with a rhythm that suggested they were discussing our presence. The voices seemed to move through the tunnel system, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind us. Dr. Williams decided we should return to the surface immediately. Her experience with underground work had taught her to take unusual conditions seriously, and the combination of equipment problems and unexplained sounds suggested potential safety issues. As we were heading back toward the entrance, we heard someone call my name from a side tunnel we hadn't explored yet. Robert, clear as anything, in what sounded like my father's voice. Robert, come over here. I've found something interesting. My father was a retired mining engineer who taught me a lot about geology, but he was back home in Colorado and had no idea where I was working. Plus, he'd never been to this particular mine. Dr. Williams grabbed my arm and kept me moving toward the entrance. We're leaving now, she said firmly. Whatever that is, it's not your father. As we reached the main tunnel, we could see daylight from the entrance about 100 yards ahead. But the voices behind us were getting louder and more insistent, now including what sounded like Dr. Williams' voice, calling to her from the depths of the mine. We made it to the surface and immediately began packing our equipment. Dr. Williams was clearly shaken by the experience and wanted to leave the site as quickly as possible. I've worked in mines all over the world, she told me, as we loaded our gear. I've never encountered anything like what just happened down there. Those voices were too accurate, too specific. Whatever's in those tunnels knows things it shouldn't know. We drove out that evening, rather than spending another night at the site. On the way back to town, Dr. Williams told me about similar experiences other mining professionals had reported over the years. Abandoned workings where people heard voices, saw figures that shouldn't have been there, or experienced equipment problems that had no technical explanation. When we filed our report with the company, we focused on the mineral potential and the structural condition of the mine workings. We included a recommendation that future work at the site be conducted by larger teams with enhanced safety protocols, citing unusual acoustic conditions and potential communication problems in the underground environment. The company decided not to pursue development of the property, officially due to economic considerations, but I suspect our report influenced their decision. Dr. Williams requested assignment to a different project, and I was transferred to surface sampling work that didn't involve underground exploration. About 6 months later, I heard through industry contacts that another exploration company had evaluated the same property and reached similar conclusions about avoiding underground work at the site. They'd apparently experienced technical difficulties and communication problems that made the work impractical. I still work in mining exploration, but I'm much more selective about underground assignments. There are plenty of surface deposits that don't require dealing with the unknowns that sometimes exist in old mine workings. Some places underground have been empty for so long that you can't predict what might have moved in to fill the silence. Story 13. The Cell Tower Technician. This happened a year ago when I was 26. I was working for a telecommunications company, maintaining cell towers in remote areas of eastern Utah. The job involved climbing towers to service equipment, replacing antennas, and troubleshooting signal problems at sites that were often hours from the nearest town. The tower I'm talking about was designated Site UT-193, located on a high mesa about 90 miles southeast of Price, Utah. It was a 200-foot self-supporting tower that provided coverage for a vast area of canyon country, including several highways and a few small communities scattered across the region. The site was accessible by a rough dirt road that took about 2 hours to navigate from the main highway. The tower itself was surrounded by a small equipment building, a backup generator, and the usual collection of antennas and dishes needed for cellular and microwave communications. I'd been assigned to upgrade the site's equipment and replace several antennas that were showing signs of wear from the harsh desert environment. The work was expected to take 3 days, so I'd brought camping gear and supplies to stay on site rather than making the long drive back and forth each day. The first day went smoothly. I climbed the tower and documented the existing equipment, then began the process of removing old antennas and installing replacement hardware. The location was spectacular. You could see for miles across red rock canyons and mesas that stretched toward the horizon. That evening, while I was cooking dinner next to my truck, I noticed that my cell phone wasn't getting any signal, despite being right next to a fully functional cell tower. That was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes the equipment configuration could create dead spots in the immediate vicinity of a tower, but my radio equipment was also acting strangely. The company radio that I used to check in with dispatch was picking up interference on all channels, and my GPS unit was having trouble maintaining satellite lock despite clear skies. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing what sounded like radio transmissions coming from the equipment building. Voices speaking in codes and technical jargon, but not on any frequency that should have been active at that site. I checked the building, but all the equipment was functioning normally, and there was no indication of unauthorized transmissions. The second day, I continued working on the antenna replacements, but I started noticing that some of my tools were being moved around when I wasn't looking. I'd set a wrench down on the tower platform, and when I turned back, it would be several feet away from where I'd left it. At first, I figured it was just the wind blowing things around, but the movement seemed too precise and deliberate for random air currents. Plus, some of the tools were too heavy to be moved by the light breeze that was typical for the area. Around noon, while I was working about 150 feet up the tower, I heard someone calling to me from the ground. "Hey, you need to come down here," in what sounded like my supervisor's voice. "There's a problem with the equipment." I looked down, but couldn't see anyone near the base of the tower. My truck was parked in its usual spot, and the equipment building appeared secure. I tried calling back, but there was no response. Over my radio, I checked with dispatch to see if my supervisor was planning to visit the site, but they said he was back in Salt Lake City and wouldn't be traveling to remote locations for the rest of the week. The voice continued calling periodically throughout the afternoon, sometimes claiming to be my supervisor, sometimes other people from the company. Each time, the voice would mention specific technical problems that supposedly needed immediate attention. But when I checked from my position on the tower, everything appeared to be functioning normally. That night, the radio interference got much worse. My equipment was picking up transmissions that sounded like normal telecommunications traffic, but the content didn't make sense. Conversations about technical issues that didn't exist, references to equipment that wasn't installed at the site, and discussions of problems that had supposedly occurred during my work that day. Around midnight, I heard my own voice coming through the radio. apparently talking to dispatch about completing the work ahead of schedule and requesting permission to leave the site early. But I wasn't transmitting, and I hadn't made any such request. I tried to call dispatch to clarify the situation, but my radio wouldn't transmit. The equipment seemed to be receiving signals normally, but every time I tried to send, nothing would go out. The third day, I decided to finish the work as quickly as possible and leave the site. I had one more antenna to install and some final testing to complete, but I could rush through the remaining tasks and be back on the road by early afternoon. But as I was working on the tower, the voices from the ground became more persistent and more accurate. I heard detailed conversations between people I knew, discussing personal information and work situations that were current and specific to my life. One voice, claiming to be my girlfriend Sarah, was asking why I hadn't returned her calls and whether I was planning to visit her parents the following weekend. But Sarah was aware of my work schedule and knew I was at a remote site without reliable phone service. Another voice, supposedly my brother, was discussing our plans to go fishing the following month, including specific details about the location we'd chosen and the equipment we needed to bring. The accuracy of the information was unsettling. These voices knew things they shouldn't know, personal details that weren't in any company records or technical communications. As I was completing the final antenna installation, about 180 feet above the ground, I heard a conversation that really got my attention. Two voices, claiming to be company engineers, were discussing technical problems with my work and the need to send someone else to redo the installation. They were describing specific mistakes I'd supposedly made, but the work they were criticizing was actually correct according to company standards. It was as if something was trying to undermine my confidence in my own technical abilities. I finished the installation and descended the tower as quickly as safety protocols allowed. All the equipment tests showed normal functionality, and the site was operating properly. But I didn't trust the readings I was getting from my instruments. As I was packing my gear to leave, I heard my supervisor's voice coming from the equipment building, apparently talking to someone about the need to replace me with a more experienced technician. The conversation included specific criticisms of my work and suggestions that I might not be suitable for remote assignments. I checked the building, but it was empty and locked, just as it had been for the past 3 days. All the equipment was functioning normally, and there was no indication that anyone else had been at the site. I drove out that afternoon and didn't stop until I reached the main highway. On the way back to the office, I called dispatch on my cell phone to report completion of the work and to verify that there had been no communications problems during my assignment. Dispatch confirmed that they'd been receiving normal check-in calls from me throughout the 3-day period, but I knew I'd made very few calls and had been unable to transmit during the last day and a half. When I filed my technical report, I focused on the equipment upgrades and site functionality. I mentioned some communication difficulties, but attributed them to atmospheric conditions and equipment interference, rather than anything unusual. My supervisor was pleased with the quality of the work and asked if I'd be interested in similar assignments at other remote sites. I told him I preferred working closer to populated areas and requested transfer to urban and suburban tower maintenance. I heard later that the company had trouble finding technicians willing to work alone at UT 193. They eventually started sending 2-person crews to that site, officially for safety reasons, but probably because single technicians kept reporting communication problems and requesting early completion of their assignments. I still work in telecommunications, but I stick to sites that are within reasonable distance of towns and other infrastructure. There's something about being alone on a tall structure in the middle of nowhere that makes you very aware of how isolated you really are, especially when your communication equipment starts giving you information that doesn't match reality. Story 14. The Seismic Monitor. This happened 10 months ago when I was 24. I was working for the US Geological Survey, maintaining a network of seismic monitoring stations scattered across remote areas of northern Arizona. The job involved visiting each station monthly to download data, calibrate equipment, and perform routine maintenance on the sensitive instruments that detect earthquake activity. The station I'm talking about was designated AZ North 47, located in an isolated section of the Arizona Strip, about 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The facility consisted of a small concrete building housing the seismometers and data recording equipment, plus a solar power system and satellite communication gear. The area was typical of the high desert plateau country, rolling terrain covered with pinyon pine and juniper trees, intersected by deep washes and scattered with red sandstone formations. It was beautiful country, but so remote that I might not see another person for the entire day I spent servicing the equipment. I'd been maintaining AZ North 47 for about 8 months without any problems. The station was relatively new, the equipment was reliable, and the data it was collecting showed normal background seismic activity for the region. It was actually one of the easier sites on my maintenance route. The first unusual thing I noticed was that the station's data showed some strange readings during overnight hours. Not earthquake signals, but regular rhythmic vibrations that occurred at the same time each night and lasted for several hours. The pattern was unlike anything in the database of known seismic sources. The frequency was too low for vehicular traffic, too regular for natural phenomena like wind or water flow, and too isolated geographically to be caused by industrial activity. I discussed the readings with my supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Martinez, who'd been analyzing seismic data for the USGS for over 15 years. She was puzzled by the pattern and suggested I spend a night at the station to see if I could identify the source of the vibrations. So on my next maintenance visit, I brought camping gear and planned to monitor the equipment during the overnight hours when the anomalous readings typically occurred. I set up my tent near the station building and prepared to stay awake during the time period when the vibrations usually started. Around 10 p.m., the seismometers began registering the familiar pattern of regular low-frequency vibrations, but I couldn't identify any obvious source for the signals. The night was calm, with little wind, and I couldn't hear any sounds that might account for the seismic activity. Around midnight, I started hearing what sounded like drumming coming from somewhere to the north of the station. Rhythmic beating, like multiple drums being played in coordination, but too distant to pinpoint the exact location. The drumming continued for about 2 hours, and the timing corresponded exactly with the anomalous seismic readings. When the sound stopped around 2 a.m., the vibrations recorded by the instruments also ceased. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the data and trying to correlate the audio patterns with the seismic signals. The correspondence was perfect. Every drumbeat was reflected in the instrument readings, suggesting that the sounds were actually causing ground vibrations strong enough to register on sensitive earthquake detection equipment. The next morning, I hiked toward the area where the drumming had seemed to originate, looking for any sign of human activity or natural features that might explain the sounds. I found what appeared to be a large clearing about half a mile from the station, surrounded by a circle of sandstone formations that could have provided natural acoustics for drumming. The clearing showed signs of recent use, areas where the ground had been disturbed, scattered ashes from what might have been fires, and several rings of stones that could have been seating arrangements. But there were no tire tracks or other evidence of how people might have reached such a remote location. More puzzling, I found bare footprints around the clearing, but they were mixed with tracks that didn't look quite human. Some of the prints showed toes that were longer and more widely spread than normal, and the gait patterns suggested individuals who were unusually tall and moved with longer strides than typical. I took photographs of the evidence and GPS coordinates of the location, then returned to the seismic station to complete my maintenance work. The equipment was functioning normally, and there was no indication of any technical problems that might have caused false readings. When I reported my findings to Dr. Martinez, she was intrigued by the correlation between the audio phenomena and the seismic data. She suggested that we might be detecting some kind of cultural or ceremonial activity that involved rhythmic movement or dancing strong enough to register on earthquake monitors. But she was puzzled by the location. The area around AZ North 47 was public land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and there were no permits on file for large gatherings or cultural events. Plus, the remoteness of the site made it an unlikely choice for any activity that required significant numbers of people. Dr. Martinez decided to contact colleagues who specialized in cultural resources and Native American relations to see if they were aware of any traditional use of the area that might explain the drumming and seismic activity. The response was interesting, but not entirely helpful. Several tribal representatives acknowledged that the general region had historical and cultural significance, but they were reluctant to discuss specific sites or activities. The message was clear that outsiders should be respectful of areas that might have traditional importance. Over the next few months, the nighttime seismic anomalies continued to appear in the data from AZ North 47, always following the same pattern and timing. Dr. Martinez decided that the readings represented legitimate seismic activity, probably caused by human activity, and should be included in our official reports. But she also arranged for the maintenance schedule to be adjusted so that I wouldn't have to spend overnight periods at the station. The new protocol called for daytime-only visits, with any necessary extended work to be conducted by two-person teams. I continued to service AZ North 47 for several more months before transferring to a different assignment. The seismic anomalies continued to appear in the data, but no one from the USGS spent additional nights at the station trying to identify their source. My replacement, a more experienced technician named Bob Kowalski, told me later that he'd heard similar drumming during one of his daytime visits, but much fainter and coming from a greater distance. He said it reminded him of traditional Native American music, but he wasn't familiar enough with the cultural context to make any specific identification. The station continues to operate normally and provides valuable seismic data for earthquake monitoring in the region. The nighttime anomalies are now simply classified as cultural activity in the official database, and no further investigation has been conducted into their specific source. I still work for the USGS, but I've moved to assignments that involve more urban seismic networks and less time in extremely remote locations. There's something to be said for working in areas where unusual activity has straightforward explanations and where help is never more than a radio call away. Story 15. The Pipeline Inspector. This happened 4 months ago when I was 25. I was working as a pipeline inspector for a natural gas company, checking sections of buried pipeline that ran through remote areas of western Wyoming. The job involved driving to designated GPS coordinates, using electronic equipment to test the pipeline's integrity, and documenting any maintenance issues that needed attention. The section of pipeline I'm talking about ran for about 30 miles through the Red Desert, an area of high plains and scattered badlands about 60 miles northeast of Rock Springs. It was empty country, no towns, few roads, and the kind of vast open space where you could see for miles in every direction. My route took me to 15 inspection points along the pipeline, each marked by a small concrete monument and a yellow warning sign. At each location, I'd use ground-penetrating radar and electronic sensors to check the condition of the buried pipe and look for any signs of leaks or corrosion. I'd been working this particular route for about 6 months and had completed dozens of inspections without any problems. The pipeline was relatively new, the equipment was reliable, and the inspection process was routine enough that I could usually complete the entire route in one long day. The first unusual thing I noticed was that some of my equipment markers were being moved between visits. I'd place small flags and stakes to mark locations where I'd completed tests, and when I returned the following month, they'd be arranged in different patterns or moved to entirely different locations. At first, I figured it was probably caused by wind or wildlife, but the movement seemed too systematic for random displacement. The markers were being rearranged rather than just scattered, sometimes forming geometric patterns or lines that pointed toward specific features in the landscape. During my inspection in March, I found that someone had been digging near several of the pipeline monuments. Not deep excavation that would threaten the buried pipe, but careful exploration that suggested someone was trying to understand the pipeline's exact location and depth. The digging was precise and methodical, using tools rather than hands or paws. Whoever was doing it knew enough about pipeline construction to avoid damaging the protective coating or disturbing the pipe itself. I reported the incidents to my supervisor as possible vandalism or copper theft, but there was no sign that anyone was actually trying to steal equipment or damage the pipeline. The excavation seemed more like investigation than attempted sabotage. The company arranged for additional security patrols in the area and installed motion-activated cameras at several of the inspection points, but the cameras didn't capture any clear images of whoever was disturbing the sites. Just occasional glimpses of movement that could have been large animals or people moving carefully to avoid detection. In April, during my monthly inspection, I encountered something that made me seriously reconsider what might be going on along the pipeline route. I was working at inspection point 7, about 15 miles from the nearest road, when I heard someone calling my name from the direction of a low ridge about a quarter mile away. Tom, clear as anything, in what sounded like my brother's voice. Tom, come over here. You need to see this. My brother lived in Denver and had no reason to be wandering around the Wyoming desert. Plus, there were no vehicles in the area other than my truck, and I hadn't seen any sign of human activity during my drive to the inspection site. I ignored the voice and continued working, but it persisted for about 20 minutes, sometimes calling my name, sometimes claiming there was something important I needed to investigate. The voice seemed to move around the ridge, as if whoever was calling was trying to find a better position to get my attention. When I finished my work at that location and drove to the next inspection point, I could see the ridge where the voice had originated. There was no sign of anyone in the area, no vehicles, and no explanation for how someone could have reached such a remote location on foot. At inspection point 8, I heard multiple voices calling from different directions around my work site. Family members, co-workers, people I knew, all asking me to stop what I was doing and come investigate various problems or discoveries that supposedly needed immediate attention. The voices were accurate in ways that were unsettling. One voice, claiming to be my supervisor, mentioned specific details about my work schedule and recent pipeline inspections that were correct and current. Another voice, supposedly my girlfriend, referenced a conversation we'd had the previous weekend about plans for a vacation trip. I completed my work as quickly as possible and drove to the next location, but the voices followed me. They seemed to be keeping pace with my truck, calling from the empty desert on both sides of the access road. The most disturbing incident occurred at inspection point 12, in an area where the pipeline crossed a series of arroyos and rocky outcrops that provided numerous places for concealment. I was setting up my equipment when I heard my own voice calling from about 50 yards away. "Hey Tom, over here. I found a problem with the pipe." I looked in the direction of the voice and saw someone who looked exactly like me standing near one of the concrete pipeline markers. Same height, same build, same work clothes, even the same equipment belt and hard hat. But something was wrong with the proportions. The figure was too tall, and the limbs seemed too long for a normal human body. When it moved, the gait was awkward, like someone trying to walk upright when they were more comfortable on all fours. The figure waved at me and called again. "Tom, you need to check this section. There's a leak." I grabbed my radio to call for assistance, and the movement seemed to startle the figure. It dropped to all fours and moved away through the rocks with a fluid motion that definitely wasn't human. I completed my inspection of that location as quickly as possible and drove back toward the main road without stopping at the remaining points on my route. I called my supervisor from the first location, where I had cell phone service, and reported equipment problems that would require a return visit with additional personnel. The company sent a 2-man crew to complete the inspection route, and they found all the pipeline equipment functioning normally. But they also found more evidence of excavation near the monuments, and several of the motion-activated cameras had malfunctioned or been repositioned to face different directions. I requested assignment to a different inspection route and was transferred to a section of pipeline that ran through more populated areas of the state. The official reason was workload balancing, but I suspect my supervisor understood that I was uncomfortable working alone in such remote locations. My replacement on the Red Desert route lasted only 2 months before also requesting a transfer. He reported similar experiences with voices, equipment disturbances, and the feeling of being watched while working in isolated areas along the pipeline. The company eventually modified the inspection protocol for that route to require 2-person teams and additional communication equipment. They also installed upgraded security systems at the most remote inspection points, officially to prevent vandalism, but probably to provide reassurance for the inspection crews. I still work in pipeline inspection, but I'm more selective about remote assignments and always make sure I have reliable communication and backup procedures when working in isolated areas. Some places just feel wrong when you're there alone, and I've learned that those instincts are worth paying attention to, even if you can't explain exactly what's causing them. Story 16. The Border Patrol Agent. This happened 13 months ago, when I was 28. I was working as a Border Patrol agent in the remote desert sector between Douglas, Arizona, and the New Mexico state line. The assignment involved patrolling vast stretches of empty country, monitoring for illegal border crossings, and providing assistance to anyone found in distress in the harsh desert environment. My patrol sector covered about 400 square miles of Sonoran Desert, accessible only by rough four-wheel drive roads and hiking trails that follow traditional smuggling routes used for decades. The terrain was brutal. Rocky washes, dense stands of ocotillo and cholla cactus, and temperatures that could reach 120 degrees during summer days and drop to near freezing on winter nights. Most of my work was done alone, driving marked Border Patrol vehicles along known crossing routes and hiking to observation points where I could watch for movement across the international boundary. The job required a combination of law enforcement skills and desert survival knowledge, plus the ability to work independently for long periods without backup. I'd been assigned to this sector for about 8 months and had become familiar with the regular patterns of activity in the area. Most border crossers followed well-established trails that connected water sources and offered some shelter from the elements. Drug smugglers used different routes, often involving vehicles and coordinated operations. The area also had a reputation among Border Patrol agents for unusual incidents that were difficult to explain in official reports. Not UFO sightings or anything that dramatic, but encounters with people or things that didn't fit normal categories of border security issues. My first strange experience occurred during a routine patrol in late January. I was checking a known crossing point near an abandoned ranch about 20 miles east of Douglas, when I found fresh footprints that didn't match any pattern I'd seen before. The tracks showed a group of individuals moving north from the border, but the footprints were unusually large and showed a gait pattern that suggested people who were much taller than typical border crossers. The stride length was nearly 4 feet, which would indicate individuals over 7 feet tall. More puzzling, the group appeared to be barefoot despite crossing terrain that was covered with sharp rocks and thorny vegetation that would be extremely painful for anyone not wearing protective footwear. Even the most desperate border crossers wore shoes or boots of some kind. I followed the tracks for about 2 miles before they disappeared in rocky ground near a series of caves that had been carved by flash floods over the centuries. The caves showed signs of recent use, areas where people had apparently rested, remains of small fires, and cached water containers. But there were no personal belongings, food wrappers, or other debris that normally accompanied human smuggling operations. The caves looked like they'd been used by people who traveled without any equipment or supplies. I called in the discovery and requested that a tracking team be sent to investigate further. The team found more of the unusual footprints, but was unable to determine where the individuals had gone after leaving the cave area. Over the next few weeks, I found similar tracks at several other locations in my patrol sector. Always the same pattern. Groups of unusually tall individuals moving north from the border, traveling barefoot across difficult terrain, and disappearing in areas that offered natural concealment. None of my colleagues in adjacent sectors were reporting similar sign, which suggested that whatever I was tracking was following routes that stayed within my specific area of responsibility. The tracks appeared regularly, about once a week, always during overnight hours when visibility was limited. In March, I had my first direct encounter with whatever was leaving the unusual tracks. I was conducting a night patrol near the border fence when I saw movement in the scrub brush, about 200 yards to the north. Through my night vision scope, I could see several figures walking in single file toward a gap in the fence. The figures were definitely not normal border crossers. They were too tall, moved with too much coordination, and seemed completely unaffected by the rough terrain. When they reached the fence, they didn't climb over or cut through the barrier. They simply seemed to flow through the gaps like liquid. I tried to get closer to intercept them, but by the time I reached the fence line, they had disappeared. The only evidence of their passage was more of those distinctive footprints and a strange smell that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something metallic. I radioed for backup and established a perimeter around the area, but a thorough search revealed no sign of the individuals I'd observed. It was as if they had simply vanished into the desert night. My supervisor, Agent Rodriguez, was skeptical of my report, but agreed to increase patrols in the area and install additional motion sensors along the fence. The sensors were triggered repeatedly over the following weeks, but they never captured clear images of whatever was setting them off. The most disturbing incident occurred in early April during a joint operation with DEA agents who were tracking a suspected drug shipment through my sector. We had set up observation posts along a known smuggling route and were monitoring the area with thermal imaging equipment. Around 2 a.m., the thermal cameras detected a large group moving north along the smuggling trail. But the heat signatures were wrong. Too large, too coordinated, and moving much faster than people on foot should have been able to travel across such difficult terrain. Agent Rodriguez directed me to intercept the group, while the DEA team moved to block their escape routes. As I approached the trail, I could hear what sounded like normal conversation in Spanish, but the voices seemed too deep, and some of the words didn't sound quite right. When I got close enough to observe the group directly, what I saw didn't make sense. There were 8 or 9 figures moving in perfect formation, but they were much larger than normal people and moved with a fluid coordination that reminded me of a pack of wolves. I called out in Spanish for them to stop and identify themselves, and the entire group immediately turned in my direction. In the dim moonlight, I could see that their faces were wrong, elongated, with features that combined human and animal characteristics. One of them responded in perfect, unaccented English. "We're just passing through, officer. We don't want any trouble." But the voice came from a figure that was clearly not human, and the casual tone was completely at odds with the alien appearance of the speaker. I drew my sidearm and radioed for immediate backup, but the group simply melted away into the desert scrub with a speed and silence that seemed impossible for anything moving on 2 legs. Agent Rodriguez and the DEA team reached my location within 10 minutes, but found no trace of the individuals I'd encountered. The thermal cameras showed nothing, and there were no footprints or other evidence of passage on the rocky ground where I'd seen them. My report of the incident was classified at a level above my security clearance, and I was transferred to a different sector within 2 weeks. The official reason was routine rotation, but I suspect my encounters had been deemed too unusual for someone in my position to continue investigating. My replacement in that sector lasted only 6 weeks before requesting transfer to a completely different region. He cited health issues related to desert assignment, but told me privately that he'd experienced similar encounters with groups that didn't behave like normal border crossers. The Border Patrol eventually designated that section of the border as a special interest area, requiring enhanced monitoring and 2 agent patrols. They also installed additional sensor equipment and upgraded their thermal imaging capabilities. I finished my career with the Border Patrol in sectors closer to urban areas, where the work involved more conventional law enforcement issues and fewer encounters with unexplained phenomena. But I never forgot those months in the desert, and I always wondered what we were really dealing with out there in that empty country along the international boundary. Story 17. The Forest Service Firefighter. This happened 2 summers ago when I was 23. I was working my second season as a wildland firefighter with the Forest Service, assigned to a crew based out of Flagstaff that covered fires throughout northern Arizona and southern Utah. It was demanding work, but I loved being outdoors and the camaraderie that came with working on a tight-knit crew that depended on each other in dangerous situations. The fire I'm talking about was designated the Lime Creek Fire, a lightning-caused blaze that had started in the remote backcountry of the Kaibab National Forest, about 40 miles north of the Grand Canyon. It wasn't a huge fire by Arizona standards, maybe 800 acres when we arrived, but it was burning in difficult terrain that made access challenging. Our crew of 20 firefighters was assigned to establish a fire break along the southern edge of the burn area, working to prevent the fire from spreading toward a small community called Marble Canyon. We'd be camping in the field for at least a week, resupplying by helicopter and maintaining radio contact with the incident command post. I was working as a sawyer, operating a chainsaw to clear brush and small trees ahead of the crew that was digging fire breaks with hand tools. It was skilled work that required constant attention to safety, especially when working in heavy smoke and unstable burned areas. Our crew boss was an experienced firefighter named Jake Morrison, who'd been fighting wildland fires for over 15 years. Jake had worked all over the West and had a reputation for keeping his crew safe while getting the job done efficiently. The first few days of the assignment went smoothly. We made good progress on the fire break, and the fire behavior was predictable enough that we could work safely in the area. The weather was typical for July in northern Arizona. Hot and dry during the day, with afternoon thunderstorms that provided some humidity, but also the risk of new lightning strikes. On our 4th day, while we were working in a section of burned forest about 3 miles from our base camp, one of our crew members reported seeing people moving through the fire area who weren't wearing any protective equipment and didn't appear to be part of any firefighting operation. The sighting was concerning because unauthorized personnel in an active fire zone represented both a safety hazard and a potential legal issue. Jake radioed the incident command post to check whether any other agencies or crews were working in our area. Command confirmed that we were the only personnel assigned to that section of the fire, and they'd had no reports of civilian intrusions into the restricted area. Jake decided to investigate and assign 2 crew members to track down whoever had been spotted in the burn zone. The crew members found tracks in the ash and soft soil, but the footprints were unusual, much larger than normal, and showing people who were apparently walking barefoot through an area where the ground was still hot from recent burning. Nobody walks barefoot through a burn area, Jake observed, when he examined the tracks. The ground temperature alone would cause severe burns, and there's hazardous debris everywhere. But the tracks were clear and recent, definitely made by people moving through the fire zone within the past few hours. They led deeper into the burned area, toward sections that were still actively smoldering and unsafe for anyone without protective equipment. That night, while we were in our sleeping bags around the camp perimeter, several crew members reported hearing voices calling from the direction of the active fire. Not distress calls or requests for help, but what sounded like normal conversation between multiple people who seemed to be unaware of the danger they were in. Jake tried to establish voice contact by shouting toward the fire area, but there was no response. The voices continued for about an hour, sometimes seeming to move closer to our camp, sometimes receding toward the more dangerous sections of the burn. We need to find these people, Jake decided. If there are civilians wandering around in there, they're going to get hurt or killed. The next morning, Jake organized a search team to locate whoever had been heard during the night. We spread out in a line and moved carefully through the burned area, following safety protocols for working in hazardous terrain. About a mile from our camp, we found a clearing where someone had obviously spent time during the night. There were areas where the ash had been disturbed, as if people had been sitting or lying on the ground, and the remains of what appeared to be a fire that had been built on top of the existing burn. That's impossible, Jake said, examining the evidence. You can't build a fire in an area that's already burned. There's no fuel, and the ground's too hot. But there were definitely ashes from a recent fire, arranged in a circle with stones around the perimeter, like a traditional campfire. The stones were still warm, and there were stick fragments that suggested someone had been feeding wood into flames. More disturbing were the footprints around the clearing. They showed multiple individuals, but the tracks were mixed with prints that didn't look quite human. Some showed toes that were too long and spread too wide, and others had claw marks that suggested people wearing some kind of unusual footwear. Jake photographed the evidence and radioed a detailed report to the incident command post. The response was immediate. We were ordered to suspend fire suppression operations and evacuate the area, while a safety team investigated the possibility of unauthorized personnel in the fire zone. As we were packing our equipment to move to a safer location, I heard someone calling my name from the direction of the active fire. Danny, clear as anything, in what sounded like my father's voice. Danny, come help us. We're trapped. My father lived in Phoenix and had no connection to wildland firefighting. There was no way he could be in the middle of an active forest fire calling for help. Jake grabbed my arm as I started to move toward the voice. Don't, he said firmly. Whatever that is, it's not your father. But the voice continued calling, now joined by others claiming to be family members and friends. They all seemed to be in distress, asking for help with specific problems that sounded urgent and believable. One voice, supposedly my girlfriend Sarah, was calling for help with a broken ankle and saying she was lost in the smoke. Another voice, claiming to be my crew boss from the previous season, was asking me to bring firefighting equipment to help with a spot fire that was threatening to escape containment. Jake ordered the entire crew to ignore the voices and focus on evacuation procedures. I've been fighting fires for 15 years, he told us, and I've never heard anything like this. We're getting out of here now. As we hiked toward our extraction point, the voices followed us, sometimes calling from ahead of our route, sometimes from behind. They seemed to know personal information about each crew member, names, family relationships, work histories, and current concerns that were accurate and specific. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, but as we were lifting off, several crew members reported seeing figures standing in the cleared areas we'd just evacuated. Tall, thin individuals who seemed unaffected by the heat and smoke, watching our departure with what appeared to be curiosity rather than concern. The incident command post classified our encounter as unexplained civilian activity and suspended firefighting operations in that section of the forest. The fire was allowed to burn naturally while safety teams investigated the area. I never learned the results of their investigation, but the Lime Creek fire was eventually declared contained without any further reports of unauthorized personnel in the burn zone. Jake was reassigned to a different fire, and our crew was disbanded for the rest of the season. Jake told me later that he'd had similar experiences during previous fires in remote areas of Arizona and New Mexico. There are things out there in the backcountry that don't follow normal rules, he said. Most of the time, they leave firefighters alone, but sometimes they get curious about our operations. I continued working as a wildland firefighter for one more season before switching to structural firefighting with an urban department. The work is more predictable, and I prefer knowing that the people I encounter in emergency situations are actually people who need help, not something else that's pretending to be human. Story 18. The Wilderness Guide. This happened 15 months ago when I was 27. I was working as a wilderness guide and survival instructor, leading multi-day backpacking trips into remote areas of the Four Corners region for clients who wanted authentic backcountry experiences. The work combined my love of the outdoors with my military training in survival and navigation skills. The trip I'm talking about was a 7-day expedition into the Maze District of Canyonlands National Park in southeastern Utah. This is some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the continental United States. A labyrinth of narrow canyons, towering sandstone formations, and hidden valleys that require expert navigation and wilderness skills to traverse safely. My clients were 2 experienced hikers from Colorado, Mark and Jennifer Thompson, who wanted to explore areas that were rarely visited by casual tourists. They'd specifically requested a route that would take them far from established trails and camping areas, into sections of the park that required technical route finding and self-sufficiency. I'd been guiding trips in the maze for over 5 years and knew the area well enough to design routes that would challenge experienced hikers while maintaining reasonable safety margins. The terrain was unforgiving, but it was also spectacularly beautiful and offered the kind of wilderness solitude that was increasingly rare in the modern world. We entered the backcountry from the Hans Flat Ranger Station, carrying 7 days' worth of food and water, plus emergency supplies for an additional 3 days. The route I'd planned would take us through a series of interconnected canyon systems, with each night's camp located near reliable water sources that I'd used during previous trips. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. We made good progress through challenging terrain, and my clients were handling the physical demands better than I'd expected. The weather was perfect for October hiking. Warm days, cool nights, and clear skies that provided excellent visibility for navigation. On our 4th day, while we were hiking through a particularly narrow section of canyon called Devil's Kitchen, we found evidence that someone else had been traveling through the area recently. Fresh footprints in sandy washes, recently disturbed rock cairns, and what appeared to be temporary campsites in alcoves along the canyon walls. This was unusual because the maze receives very few visitors, especially during the off-season, and anyone hiking in such remote terrain would normally be part of a guided group or an extremely experienced solo traveler. The evidence suggested at least 3 individuals who were moving without heavy packs and apparently weren't following established routes. More puzzling, some of the footprints showed people who were walking barefoot across terrain that would be extremely difficult and painful without proper hiking boots. The sandstone was sharp and rough, and there were areas of loose rock that would be treacherous for anyone not wearing protective footwear. I mentioned the signs to Mark and Jennifer, describing them as evidence of other hikers in the area. But privately, I was concerned because the movement patterns didn't match normal backpacking behavior. and some of the tracks showed individuals with unusually large feet and long stride lengths. That evening, while we were cooking dinner at our campsite in a sheltered alcove, we heard voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the canyon system. Conversation between multiple people, speaking too low to understand the words, but with a rhythm that suggested they were discussing our presence. The acoustics in narrow canyons can be deceiving, making sounds seem much closer or more distant than they actually are. But these voices had a quality that didn't sound quite right, too deep, with an echo that suggested speakers who were much larger than normal people. "Should we try to make contact?" Jennifer asked. "Maybe they're lost or need assistance." I decided against it. The remote location and the unusual tracking sign I'd observed made me cautious about approaching strangers in such an isolated setting. My military training had taught me to be wary of situations where I didn't have complete information about potential threats. Instead, I suggested we maintain a low profile and continue with our planned route. If the other group was in genuine distress, they would make obvious efforts to signal for help. If they were avoiding contact, it was better to respect their privacy and avoid potential conflicts. The next morning, we found that our campsite had been visited during the night. Our equipment hadn't been disturbed, but there were fresh footprints around the perimeter of our sleeping area, and several of our water containers had been moved and carefully examined. The prints showed the same characteristics I'd been seeing: unusually large, barefoot, with a gait pattern that suggested people who were much taller than average. But now they were accompanied by handprints on the sandstone walls, with fingers that seemed longer and thinner than normal human proportions. Mark and Jennifer were concerned about the nighttime visit, but I assured them that wilderness encounters with other travelers were usually harmless, even if they seemed strange. I did suggest that we modify our route to avoid areas where we might encounter the other group again. But as we hiked deeper into the canyon system, we continued to find evidence that we were being followed or observed. Fresh tracks that paralleled our route, recently disturbed areas where someone had apparently been watching our progress, and occasional glimpses of movement on the canyon rims high above our location. The most unsettling incident occurred on our 6th day, when we were hiking through a section called the Granary, known for its collection of ancient ancestral Puebloan ruins and rock art. As we were examining some well-preserved petroglyphs, we heard someone calling from an alcove about 100 yards away. "Hello," in perfect, unaccented English. "Could you come help us with something?" I looked toward the alcove but couldn't see anyone clearly. The voice seemed to come from deeper in the shadows, where the sandstone overhang created areas of deep shadow even during midday. "We're fine," I called back. "Do you need assistance?" "Yes," the voice replied. "We have someone who's injured. Could you bring your first aid supplies?" My clients were ready to respond immediately, but something about the situation felt wrong. The voice was too calm for someone dealing with a genuine medical emergency, and I hadn't seen any sign of camping gear or other equipment that would suggest a legitimate hiking group. "Where are you from?" I called toward the alcove. There was a long pause before the voice responded. "We're local. We live in this area." That was impossible. The maze was federal wilderness land with no permanent residents, and the nearest towns were over 50 miles away across some of the most difficult terrain in Utah. I told Mark and Jennifer that we needed to continue with our hike, and we moved quickly through that section of canyon. As we left, I could hear multiple voices calling from the alcove, now claiming to be park rangers who needed to check our permits and camping equipment. but I knew all the rangers who worked in the maze district, and none of them had voices that matched what we were hearing. Plus, rangers working in such remote areas would have identified themselves immediately and would have been equipped with proper uniforms and communication equipment. On our final day, as we were hiking out toward our extraction point, we encountered something that convinced me we'd been dealing with more than just unusual fellow hikers. We were climbing a steep section of slick rock when Jennifer spotted someone watching us from a ledge about 200 feet above our position. Through binoculars, I could see a tall figure standing motionless against the red sandstone. It appeared to be human, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed elongated compared to normal human anatomy. As I watched, the figure raised one arm in what might have been a greeting or farewell gesture. Then it stepped backward and disappeared behind the rock formations with a fluid motion that suggested it was completely comfortable moving across terrain that would challenge even experienced rock climbers. We completed our exit from the backcountry without further incident, but Mark and Jennifer were clearly shaken by the week's experiences. They'd come expecting wilderness challenges and solitude, not encounters with inhabitants who seemed to belong to the landscape in ways that normal people didn't. When I filed my trip report with the Park Service, I focused on route conditions and weather observations. I mentioned encountering other travelers in the backcountry, but described them in terms that wouldn't raise questions about permit violations or unauthorized activities. I continued guiding trips in the Four Corners region for several more months, but I avoided routes that took clients into the deepest and most remote sections of the canyon country. There are places in that landscape that feel older and more alien than anywhere else I've traveled, and some encounters are better left unexplored. Story 19. The Backcountry Ranger. This happened 11 months ago when I was 30. I was working as a backcountry ranger for the National Park Service, assigned to patrol the remote wilderness areas of Big Bend National Park in southwestern Texas. The job involved hiking long distances through desert and mountain terrain, monitoring wildlife, checking on backpackers, and maintaining trails in areas that might not see another human being for weeks at a time. Big Bend covers over 800,000 acres of Chihuahuan desert along the Rio Grande, with elevations ranging from about 800 feet along the river to over 7,800 feet in the Chisos Mountains. Much of the park is designated wilderness, accessible only on foot or horseback, and some sections are so remote that even experienced desert travelers avoid them. My patrol district included the western section of the park, an area of low desert hills, arroyos, and scattered mountain ranges that bordered Mexico along about 30 miles of the Rio Grande. It was beautiful country in a harsh, unforgiving way, and it demanded respect from anyone who ventured into its remote reaches. I'd been working in Big Bend for about 3 years and had developed a deep appreciation for the desert ecosystem and the challenges of backcountry law enforcement in such an isolated environment. The work required a combination of wilderness skills, law enforcement training, and the ability to work independently for extended periods. Most of my patrols lasted 3 to 5 days, during which I'd hike circuits that covered 30 to 50 miles of backcountry trails and cross-country routes. I carried everything I needed for extended wilderness travel, plus law enforcement equipment and communication gear that allowed me to contact park headquarters in case of emergencies. The incident I'm describing occurred during a routine patrol of the Mariscal Canyon area, a section of the park where the Rio Grande cuts through towering limestone cliffs and creates one of the most spectacular and remote landscapes in Texas. The area sees few visitors because of its distance from park roads and the technical skills required for safe travel. I was 3 days into a 5-day patrol when I started noticing signs that someone else was traveling through the area. Fresh footprints along animal trails, recently disturbed vegetation, and what appeared to be temporary campsites in sheltered areas where someone had spent time without leaving the usual debris associated with modern camping. The tracking sign was puzzling because it suggested individuals who were traveling without any visible equipment, no backpacks, sleeping bags, or cooking gear, yet apparently spending multiple nights in the desert without any obvious means of survival. The footprints were also unusual in size and pattern, much larger than average, with a stride length that indicated people over 7 feet tall, and showing individuals who were apparently walking barefoot across terrain that included sharp limestone, thorny vegetation, and rocky washes that would be extremely painful without protective footwear. On my 4th day, while I was checking a backcountry campsite near the river, I encountered direct evidence that I was sharing the area with something that didn't fit normal categories of park visitors. I was examining an old fire ring when I heard voices coming from a grove of cottonwood trees about 50 yards away. The conversation was in Spanish, but the voices were too deep, and the accent was unlike anything I'd heard from the Mexican nationals who occasionally crossed the river into the park. The speakers seemed to be discussing my presence, but using words and phrases that didn't quite make sense in the context. I approached the grove carefully, using law enforcement tactics for potentially dangerous encounters, but found no sign of anyone in the area. The voices stopped as I got closer, and there was no evidence of recent human activity among the trees. But I did find more of the unusual footprints, and this time they were accompanied by what appeared to be claw marks on the bark of several cottonwood trees, too high above ground to have been made by any local wildlife, and showing a pattern that suggested something with human-like hands but much longer fingers. That evening, while I was cooking dinner at my campsite near Mariscal Creek, I heard someone calling my name from across the river in Mexico. Ranger Patterson, clear as anything, in what sounded like my supervisor's voice. Ranger Patterson, we need you to come check on something. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Williams, was back at park headquarters in Panther Junction, over 40 miles away, and there was no reason for him to be calling from the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. I tried to establish radio contact with park headquarters, but I was in a dead zone where the canyon walls blocked satellite communication. The voice continued calling from across the river, now joined by others claiming to be Park Service personnel who needed assistance with various situations that supposedly required immediate attention. The accuracy of the voices was unsettling. They knew my name, my position, and details about park operations that suggested knowledge of internal communications and personnel assignments. But they were calling from a location where no legitimate Park Service personnel would be operating. I maintained my position at the campsite and didn't respond to the voices, following standard protocols for potentially dangerous encounters with unknown individuals. After about an hour, the calling stopped, and normal desert sounds resumed. The next morning, as I was preparing to hike out and complete my patrol, I found that my campsite had been visited during the night. My equipment hadn't been disturbed, but there were fresh footprints around the perimeter of my sleeping area, and several items had been moved and carefully examined. My water containers had been opened and apparently tasted or tested, then closed and returned to their original positions. My food cache had been gone through systematically, with items removed, examined, and neatly replaced. Even my law enforcement equipment had been inspected, with my radio and GPS unit showing fingerprints that were larger than human normal and showed unusual ridge patterns. Most disturbing were the tracks leading from my campsite toward the river. They showed whatever had visited me during the night had spent considerable time at the water's edge, apparently studying the current and the crossing points that connected the American and Mexican sides of the Rio Grande. I photographed the evidence and documented the GPS coordinates, then completed my patrol by hiking out through Boquillas Canyon to the park road. When I reached an area with radio coverage, I contacted park headquarters to report the unusual encounters and request guidance on how to handle similar situations in the future. Chief Ranger Williams was concerned about the incidents, particularly the voices claiming to be Park Service personnel. He arranged for additional security protocols in the remote sections of the park and updated our communication procedures to include authentication codes for any unusual radio traffic. But he also shared information that wasn't included in official Park Service documentation. Over the years, several rangers had reported similar encounters in the most remote sections of Big Bend, particularly in areas near the international boundary, where traditional smuggling routes crossed between Mexico and Texas. The local people on both sides of the river have stories about this area, Williams told me. Things that go back generations, long before it became a national park. Most of it sounds like folklore, but when you work out here long enough, you learn to keep an open mind about what might be sharing the desert with us. I continued working as a backcountry ranger for another year, but I requested reassignment to sections of the park that were closer to developed areas and regular visitor traffic. The remote desert patrols were challenging and rewarding, but they also involved encounters that were difficult to explain in official reports. My replacement in the Western District, a ranger with over 20 years of experience in southwestern parks, lasted only 6 months before also requesting reassignment. He cited the isolation and communication difficulties, but mentioned privately that he'd had experiences similar to mine during solo patrols in the most remote areas. The Park Service eventually modified patrol protocols for the Western District to include 2 ranger teams and enhanced communication equipment. The official reason was improved safety procedures, but those of us who'd worked the area understood that some places in the desert were better approached with backup and reliable ways to call for help.